All About the Little Small Red Hen by Anonymous. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. All About the Little Small Red Hen. Once upon a time, though I can't say exactly when, there lived away in the country a little small red hen. She wore a nice little apron and a little sunbonnet too, and she walked pickety-peckety as little hens always do. She had lived the whole of her little life in the same little house it stood, all by itself in a lonely spot just at the edge of a wood. It was very snug and cozy and warm, and the garden wasn't big, but just what a little small red hen could nicely manage to dig. And once upon a time, just the same time of course, there also lived a wicked old fox among the heath and gorse. Silently, slyly, he crept round the fields, stealing geese and ducks and cocks. Dressed in a hat and long great coat, this wicked, cunning old fox. His house was perched on top of the hill. It was made of rock and stone. He and his wife, Old Mother Fox, they lived there all alone. It was large and damp and draughty, ugly and cold and bare. A tidy little small red hen would never be happy there. Now, the wicked old fox had often tried, over and over again, to catch by some sly trick or other the little small red hen. But she was far too clever for him. She never let him find her, and whenever she left her little house, she would lock the door behind her. One morning, very early indeed, before the sun was hot, the wicked old fox said to Mother Fox, "Put on the big black pot. I'm going to have another try. I shall soon be back, and then I promise you'll see at last I've caught the little small red hen." So he put on his cap and shouldered a sack and walked very sly and slow, and after a while he came in sight of the snug little house below, and he laid the sack very softly down on the ground behind a tree, and then lay down to wait and watch as quiet could be. He was getting tired of waiting there when the house door opened wide, and the little small red hen came forth to gather sticks outside. Walking pickety-peckety, exceedingly neat and prim, and the wicked old fox lay watching, she never once thought of him. While she was picking up the sticks, he slipped behind the door and laughed ho-ho to himself very low as he put the sack on the floor. He stood there hiding and chuckling and peeping through the crack, and he saw the little small red hen in a minute or two come back. She stepped inside with her bundle of sticks, as cheerful as one could be, when the wicked old fox sprang full at her throat. "I've got you now," cried he. "What good are bolts and bars?" he said. "How silly you must be! To think that they could ever keep out a cunning old fox like me." Of course the poor little small red hen was now in a terrible fright. She gave a scream and dropped her sticks. They tumbled left and right. But she just had time to fly on a beam that went across overhead, quite out of reach of the wicked old fox. "But I'll have you yet," he said. Then he began to run round and round and round and round beneath, looking up every now and then, laughing and showing his teeth. It made her dreadfully dizzy and faint. She gave a cluck and a lurch. She gave a flap and a flutter and flop, and fell right off her perch. Then the wicked old fox threw open his sack, and in less than half a minute he had picked her up with a cry of joy and hastily stuffed her in it. He swung it over his shoulder, smiled, and started off for his den. "How nice you'll be for supper," said he. "My dear little small red hen." So there she was, poor thing, you see, shut up quite tight in the sack. She found it most unpleasant there, close and stuffy and black. But she thought of her little scissors, in her apron pocket hid. "I will cut a hole and see where I am," she said, and so she did. Now the sun was hot, and all the time it was getting hotter still, and the wicked old fox grew very tired as he climbed the healthy hill. He dropped on mossy bank and said, "It may be lazy, but I think I'll just have 40 winks." And his wicked eyes blinked and shut. The little small red hen, indeed, was also very glad to rest a bit from the jogs and jolts and the bangs and bumps she'd had. And she thought, if I cut a little hole, why not a big one too? And she cut a slit that was long enough to let her whole self through. Wasn't she pleased to be free again? She said, "I must run double quick. But before I go, I'll manage to play the wicked old fox a trick." And she took a great big knobby stone, as large as a lump of coal, and heaved and pushed and pushed and heaved till she got it through the hole. And then she scuttled panting home as fast as her legs would go, not walking pickety-peckety this time, oh dear no. She scuttered and fluttered down the hill and scampered through her door. "Thank goodness," she said, all out of breath. "I'm safe at home once more." But when the wicked old fox woke up, it was getting dark and late. He shouldered the sack and found it now a most remarkable weight. "Dear me," he said, "she weighs like a goose. I thought she'd be light as a wren. What a splendid supper we'll have tonight off the little small red hen." So heavily, wearily trudged he home, and kept shifting the sack about. And when at last he came to his door, there was old Mother Fox looking out. She said to him, "You look tired, my dear." And he answered, "Ah, she's caught." And he puffed and licked his lips and said, "She's twice as fat as I thought." He asked, "My love, is the pot on the boil?" "It's boiling fast," she replied. He said, "Then take the lid off, my dear, and we'll pop her plump inside." So old Mother Fox took off the lid, hot and steaming and black, while the wicked old fox, with hurry and haste, untied the mouth of the sack. And splash went in the great big stone. It was a splash, my word. I don't suppose a splash so loud has ever before been heard. The bees and birds and bunnies all, who had gone to bed for the night, for miles around woke up with a jump in a most tremendous fright. And the boiling water in the pot splashed out on every side, and terribly scalded the wicked old fox and old Mother Fox, and they died. There they lay, all still and stark, up in the house on the hill. There they lay, and for all I know, there they are lying still. But the hen lived happily just as before, in her dear little house by the wood, walking pickety-peckety, working as hard as she could. I've had a great many troubles. I hope they won't happen again. Anything for a quiet life, said the little small red hen. The end. End of All About the Little Small Red Hen by Anonymous. Read by Harmon Busby.
The Capture of Father Time by L. Frank Baum. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Jim was a son of a cowboy and lived on the broad plains of Arizona. His father had trained him to lasso a bronco or a young bull with perfect accuracy, and had Jim possessed the strength to back up his skill, he would have been as good a cowboy as any in all Arizona. When he was 12 years old, he made his first visit to the East, where Uncle Charles, his father's brother, lived. Of course, Jim took his lasso with him, for he was proud of his skill in casting it, and he wanted to show his cousins what a cowboy could do. At first, the city boys and girls were much interested in watching Jim lasso posts and fence pickets, but soon they tired of it, and even Jim decided it was not the right sort of sport for cities. But one day, the butcher asked Jim to ride one of his horses into the country, to a pasture that had been engaged, and Jim eagerly consented. He had been longing for a horseback ride, and to make it seem like old times, he took his lasso with him. He rode through the streets demurely enough, but on reaching the open country roads, his spirit broke forth into wild jubilation, and, urging the butcher's horse to full gallop, he dashed away in true cowboy fashion. Then he still wanted more liberty, and, letting down the bars that led into a big field, he began riding over the meadow and throwing his lasso at imaginary cattle, while he yelled and whooped to his heart's content. Suddenly, on making a long cast with his lasso, the loop caught upon something and rested about 3 feet from the ground, while the rope drew taut and nearly pulled Jim from his horse. This was unexpected. More than that, it was wonderful, for the field seemed bare of even a stump. Jim's eyes grew big with amazement, but he knew he had caught something when a voice cried out, "Here, let go! Let go, I say! Can't you see what you've done?" No, Jim couldn't see, nor did he intend to let go until he found out what was holding the loop of the lasso. So he resorted to an old trick his father had taught him, and, putting the butcher's horse to a run, began riding in a circle around the spot where his lasso had caught. As he thus drew nearer and nearer his quarry, he saw the rope coil up, yet it looked to be coiling over nothing but air. One end of the lasso was made fast to a ring in the saddle, and when the rope was almost wound up and the horse began to pull away and snort with fear, Jim dismounted. Holding the reins of the bridle in one hand, he followed the rope, and an instant later saw an old man caught fast in the coils of the lasso. His head was bald and uncovered, but long white whiskers grew down to his waist. About his body was thrown a loose robe of fine white linen. In one hand he bore a great scythe, and beneath the other arm he carried an hourglass. While Jim gazed wonderingly upon him, this venerable old man spoke in an angry voice. "Now then, get that rope off as fast as you can. You've brought everything on earth to a standstill by your foolishness. Well, what are you staring at? Don't you know who I am?" "No," said Jim stupidly. "Well, I'm Time, Father Time. Now make haste and set me free, if you want the world to run properly." "How did I happen to catch you?" asked Jim, without making a move to release his captive. "I don't know. I've never been caught before," growled Father Time. "But I suppose it was because you were foolishly throwing your lasso at nothing." "I didn't see you," said Jim. "Of course you didn't. I'm invisible to the eyes of human beings unless they get within 3 feet of me, and I take care to keep more than that distance away from them. That's why I was crossing this field, where I supposed no one would be, and I should have been perfectly safe had it not been for your beastly lasso. Now then," he added crossly, "are you going to get that rope off?" "Why should I?" asked Jim. "Because everything in the world stopped moving the moment you caught me. I don't suppose you want to make an end of all business and pleasure, and war and love, and misery and ambition, and everything else, do you? Not a watch has ticked since you tied me up here like a mummy." Jim laughed. It really was funny to see the old man wound round and round with coils of rope from his knees up to his chin. "It'll do you good to rest," said the boy. "From all I've heard, you lead a rather busy life." "Indeed, I do. replied Father Time with a sigh. "I'm due in Kamchatka this very minute, and to think one small boy is upsetting all my regular habits." "Too bad," said Jim with a grin. "But since the world has stopped anyhow, it won't matter if it takes a little longer recess. As soon as I let you go, time will fly again. Where are your wings?" "I haven't any," answered the old man. "That is a story cooked up by someone who never saw me. As a matter of fact, I move rather slowly." "I see. You take your time," remarked the boy. "What do you use that scythe for?" "To mow down the people," said the ancient one. "Every time I swing my scythe, someone dies." "Then I ought to win a life-saving medal by keeping you tied up," said Jim. "Some folks will live this much longer." "But they won't know it," said Father Time with a sad smile. "So it will do them no good. You may as well untie me at once." "No," said Jim with a determined air. "I may never capture you again, so I'll hold you for a while and see how the world wags without you." Then he swung the old man, bound as he was, upon the back of the butcher's horse, and, getting into the saddle himself, started back toward town, one hand holding his prisoner and the other guiding the reins. When he reached the road, his eye fell on a strange tableau. A horse and buggy stood in the middle of the road, the horse in the act of trotting, with his head held high and two legs in the air, but perfectly motionless. In the buggy, a man and a woman were seated, but they had been turned to stone. They could not have been more still and stiff. "There's no time for them," sighed the old man. "Won't you let me go now?" "Not yet," replied the boy. He rode on until he reached the city, where all the people stood in exactly the same positions they were in when Jim lassoed Father Time. Stopping in front of a big dry goods store, the boy hitched his horse and went in. The clerks were measuring out goods and showing patterns to the rows of customers in front of them, but everyone seemed suddenly to have become a statue. There was something very unpleasant in this scene, and a cold shiver began to run up and down Jim's back, so he hurried out again. On the edge of the sidewalk sat a poor, crippled beggar, holding out his hat, and beside him stood a prosperous-looking gentleman who was about to drop a penny into the beggar's hat. Jim knew this gentleman to be very rich, but rather stingy, so he ventured to run his hand into the man's pocket, take out his purse, and in which was a $20 gold piece. This glittering coin he put into the gentleman's fingers instead of the penny, and then restored the purse to the rich man's pocket. "That donation will surprise him when he comes to life," thought the boy. He mounted the horse again and rode up the street, and he passed the shop of his friend, the butcher. He noticed several pieces of meat hanging outside. "I'm afraid that meat'll spoil," he remarked. "It takes time to spoil meat," answered the old man. This struck Jim as being queer, but true. "It seems time meddles with everything," said he. "Yes, you've made a prisoner out of the most important personage in the world," groaned the old man, "and you haven't enough sense to let him go again." Jim did not reply, and soon they came to his uncle's house, where he again dismounted. The street was filled with teams and people, but all were motionless. His two little cousins were just coming out the gate on their way to school, with their books and slates underneath their arms, so Jim had to jump over the fence to avoid knocking them down. In the front room sat his aunt, reading her Bible. She was just turning a page when time stopped. In the dining room was his uncle, finishing his luncheon. His mouth was open and his fork poised just before it, while his eyes were fixed upon the newspaper folded beside him. Jim helped himself to his uncle's pie, and while he ate it, he walked out to his prisoner. "There's one thing I don't understand," said he. "What's that?" asked Father Time. Why is it that I'm able to move around while everyone else is froze up?"
"That's because I'm your prisoner," answered the other. "You can do anything you wish with time now. But unless you are careful, you'll do something you will be very sorry for."
Jim threw the crust of his pie at a bird that was suspended in the air, where it had been flying when time stopped. "Anyway," he laughed, "I'm living longer than anyone else. No one will ever be able to catch up with me again."
"Each life has its allotted time span," said the old man. "When you have lived your proper time, my scythe will mow you down."
"I forgot your scythe," said Jim thoughtfully. Then a spirit of mischief came into the boy's head, for he happened to think that the present opportunity to have fun would never occur again. He tied Father Time to his uncle's hitching post that he might not escape, and then crossed the road to the corner grocery. The grocer had scolded Jim that very morning for stepping into a basket of turnips by accident, so the boy went to the back of the grocery and turned on the faucet of the molasses barrel. "That'll make a nice mess when time starts, the molasses running all over the floor," said Jim with a laugh. A little further down the street was a barber shop, and, sitting in the barber's chair, Jim saw the man that all the boys declared was the meanest man in town. He certainly did not like the boys, and the boys knew it. The barber was in the act of shampooing this person when time was captured. Jim ran to the drugstore, and, getting a bottle of mucilage, he returned and poured it over the ruffled hair of the unpopular citizen. "That'll probably surprise him when he wakes up," thought Jim. Nearby was the schoolhouse. Jim entered it and found that only a few of the pupils were assembled, but the teacher sat at his desk, stern and frowning as usual. Taking a piece of chalk, Jim marked upon the blackboard in big letters the following words: "Every scholar is requested to yell the minute he enters the room. He will also please throw his books at the teacher's head. Signed, Professor Sharp." "That ought to raise a nice rumpus," murmured the mischief maker as he walked away. On the corner stood Policeman Mulligan, talking with old Miss Scrapple, the worst gossip in town, who always delighted in saying something disagreeable about her neighbors. Jim thought this opportunity was too good to lose, so he took off the policeman's cap and brass-button coat and put them on Miss Scrapple, while the lady's feathered and ribboned hat he placed jauntily upon the policeman's head. The effect was so comical that the boy laughed aloud, and, as a good many people were standing near the corner, Jim decided that Miss Scrapple and Officer Mulligan would create a sensation when time started upon his travels. Then the young cowboy remembered his prisoner, and, walking back to the hitching post, he came within 3 feet of it and saw Father Time still standing patiently within the toils of the lasso. He looked angry and annoyed, however, and growled out,
"Well, when do you intend to release me?"
"I've been thinking about that ugly scythe of yours," said Jim.
"What about it?"
asked Father Time. "Perhaps if I let you go, you'll swing it at me the first thing to be revenged," replied the boy. Father Time gave him a severe look, but said,
"I've known boys for thousands of years, and of course I know they're mischievous and reckless. But I like boys because they grow up to be men and people my world. Now, if a man had caught me by accident, as you did, I could have scared him into letting me go instantly. But boys are harder to scare. I don't know as I blame you. I was a boy myself, long ago, when the world was new. But surely you've had enough fun with me by this time, and now I hope you'll show the respect that is due to old age. Let me go, and in return I will promise to forget all about my capture. The incident won't do much harm anyway, for no one will ever know that time has halted the last 3 hours or so."
"All right," said Jim cheerfully. "Since you've promised not to mow me down, I'll let you go." but he had a notion some people in the town would suspect time had stopped when they returned to life. He carefully unwound the rope from the old man, who, when he was free, at once shouldered his scythe, rearranged his white robe, and nodded farewell. The next moment he had disappeared, and with a rustle and rumble and roar of activity, the world came to life again and jogged along as it always had before. Jim wound up his lasso, mounted the butcher's horse, and rode slowly down the street. Loud screams came from the corner, where a great crowd of people quickly assembled. From his seat on the horse, Jim saw Miss Scrapple, attired in the policeman's uniform, angrily shaking her fist in Mulligan's face, while the officer was furiously stamping upon the lady's hat, which he had torn from his own head amidst the jeers of the crowd. As he rode past the schoolhouse, he heard a tremendous chorus of yells, and knew Professor Sharp was having a hard time to quell the riot caused by the sign on the blackboard. Through the window of the barber shop, he saw the mean man frantically belaboring the barber with a hairbrush, while his hair stood up stiff as bayonets in all directions. And the grocer ran out of his door and yelled, "Fire!" while his shoes left a track of molasses wherever he stepped. Jim's heart was filled with joy. He was fairly reveling in the excitement he had caused when someone caught his leg and pulled him from the horse.
"What are ye doing here, ye rascal?" cried the butcher angrily. "Didn't ye promise to put that beast inter Plimpton's pasture? And now I find ye riding the poor nag around like a gentleman o' leisure."
"That's a fact," said Jim, with surprise. "I clean forgot about the horse." This story should teach us the supreme importance of time and the folly of trying to stop it. For should you succeed, as Jim did, in bringing time to a standstill, the world would soon become a dreary place and life decidedly unpleasant. End of The Capture of Father Time. Read by Tabby Hart.
The Mouse, the Bird, and the Sausage. Fairy Tales by the Brothers Grimm. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Liza Fox. The Bird, the Mouse, and the Sausage by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time, a mouse, a bird, and a sausage entered into a partnership and set up house together. For a long time all went well. They lived in great comfort and prospered so far as to be able to add considerably to their stores. The bird's duty was to fly daily into the wood and bring in fuel. The mouse fetched the water, and the sausage saw to the cooking. When people are too well off, they always begin to long for something new. And so it came to pass that the bird, while out one day, met a fellow bird to whom he boastfully expatiated on the excellence of his household arrangements. But the bird sneered at him for being a poor simpleton who did all the hard work while the other two stayed at home and had a good time of it. For when the mouse had made the fire and fetched the water, she could retire into her little room and rest until it was time to set the table. The sausage had only to watch the pot to see when the food was properly cooked, and when it was near dinner time, he just threw himself into the broth or rolled in and out of the vegetables 3 or 4 times, and there they were, buttered and salted and ready to be served. Then, when the bird came home and laid aside his burden, they sat down to table, and when they finished their meal, they could sleep their fill until the following morning, and that really was a very delightful life. Influenced by those remarks, the bird next morning refused to bring in wood, telling the others that he'd been their servant long enough, and had been a fool into the bargain, and that it was now time to make a change, and to try some other way of arranging the work. Beg and pray as the mouse and the sausage might, it was of no use. The bird remained master of the situation, and the venture had to be made. They therefore drew lots, and it fell to the sausage to bring in the wood, and the mouse to cook, and the bird to fetch the water. And now what happened? The sausage started in search of wood, the bird made the fire, and the mouse put on the pot, and then these two waited till the sausage returned with the fuel for the following day. But the sausage remained so long away that they became uneasy, and the bird flew out to meet him. He had not flown far, however, when he came across a dog who, having met the sausage, had regarded him as his legitimate booty, and so seized and swallowed him. The bird complained to the dog of this barefaced robbery, but nothing he said was of any avail, for the dog answered that he found false credentials on the sausage, and that was the reason why his life had been forfeited. He picked up the wood and flew sadly home, and told the mouse all he had seen and heard. They were both very unhappy, but agreed to make the best of things and to remain with one another. So now the bird set the table, and the mouse looked after the food, and wishing to prepare it in the same way as the sausage, he rolling in and out of the vegetables to salt and butter them, she jumped into the pot, but she stopped short long before she reached the bottom, having already parted not only with her skin and hair, but also with life. Presently the bird came in and wanted to serve up the dinner, but he could nowhere see the cook. In his alarm and flurry, he threw the wood here and there about the floor, called and searched, but no cook was to be found. Then some of the wood that had been carelessly thrown down caught fire and began to blaze. The bird hastened to fetch some water, but his pail fell into the well, and he after it, and he was unable to recover himself. He was drowned. End of The Bird, the Mouse, and the Sausage. Recording by Liza Fox.
Goody Two-Shoes by Anonymous. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact librivox.org. Goody Two-Shoes. Farmer Meanwell was at one time a very rich man. He owned large fields and had fine flocks of sheep and plenty of money. But all at once his good fortune seemed to desert him. Year after year his crops failed, his sheep died off, and he was obliged to borrow money to pay his rent and the wages of those who worked on the farm. At last he had to sell his farm, but even this did not bring him in money enough to pay his debts, and he was worse off than ever. Among those who had lent money to Farmer Meanwell were Sir Thomas Gripe and a farmer named Grassball. Sir Thomas was a very rich man indeed, and Farmer Grassball had more money than he could possibly use. But they were both very greedy and covetous, and particularly hard on those who owed them anything. Farmer Grassball abused Farmer Meanwell and called him all sorts of dreadful names. But the rich Sir Thomas Gripe was more cruel still, and wanted the poor debtor shut up in jail. So poor Farmer Meanwell had to hasten from the place where he had lived for so many years in order to get out of the way of these greedy men. He went to the next village, taking his wife and his 2 little children with him. But though he was free from Gripe and Grassball, he was not free from trouble and care. He soon fell ill, and when he found himself unable to get food and clothes for his family, he grew worse and worse, and soon died. His wife could not bear the loss of her husband, whom she loved so dearly, and in a few days she was dead. The 2 orphan children seemed to be left entirely alone in the world, with no one to look after them or care for them but their heavenly Father. They trotted around hand in hand, and the poorer they became, the more they clung to each other. Poor, ragged, and hungry enough they were. Tommy had 2 shoes, but Marjorie went barefoot. They had nothing to eat but the berries that grew in the woods, and the scraps they could get from the poor people in the village, and at night they slept in barns or under haystacks. Their rich relations were too proud to notice them. But Mr. Smith, the clergyman of the village where the children were born, was not that sort of man. A rich relation came to visit him, a kind-hearted gentleman, and the clergyman told him all about Tommy and Marjorie. The kind gentleman pitied them, and ordered Marjorie a pair of shoes, and gave Mr. Smith money to buy her some clothes, which she needed sadly. As for Tommy, he said he would take him off to sea with him and make him a sailor. After a few days, the gentleman said he must go to London and would take Tommy with him. And sad was the parting between the two children. Poor Marjorie was very lonely indeed without her brother, and might have cried herself sick but for the new shoes that were brought home to her. They turned her thoughts from her grief, and as soon as she had put them on, she ran into Mrs. Smith and cried out, "Two shoes, Mum, 2 shoes!" These words she repeated to everyone she met, and thus it was she got the name of Goody Two-Shoes. Little Marjorie had seen how good and wise Mr. Smith was, and thought it was because of his great learning, and she wanted above all things to learn to read. At last she made up her mind to ask Mr. Smith to teach her when he had a moment to spare. He readily agreed to do this, and Marjorie read to him an hour every day and spent much time with her books. Then she laid out a plan for teaching others more ignorant than herself. She cut out of thin pieces of wood 10 sets of large and small letters of the alphabet, and carried these with her when she went from house to house. When she came to Billy Wilson's, she threw down the letters all in a heap, and Billy picked them out and sorted them in lines thus: capital A over A, capital B over B, capital C over C, capital D over D, capital E over E, capital F over F, capital G over G, capital H over H, capital I over I, capital J over J, capital K over K, and so on until all the letters were in their right places. From there, Goody Two-Shoes trotted off to another cottage, and here were several children waiting for her. As soon as the little girl came in, they all crowded around her and were eager to begin their lessons at once. Then she threw the letters down and said to the boy next to her, "What did you have for dinner today?" "Bread," answered the little boy. "We'll put down the first letter," said Goody Two-Shoes. Then he put down capital B, and the next child R, and the next E, and the next A, and the next D, and there was the whole word, bread. "What did you have for dinner, Polly Driggs?" "Apple pie," said Polly, upon which she laid down the first letter, capital A, and the next put down a P, and the next another P, and so on until the words apple and pie were united, and stood thus, apple pie. Now it happened one evening that Goody Two-Shoes was going home rather late. She had made a longer round than usual, and everybody had kept her waiting, so that night came on before her day's work was done. Right glad was she to set out for her own home, and she walked along contentedly through the fields and lanes and roads, enjoying the quiet evening. The evening was not cool, however, but close and sultry, and betokened a storm. Presently a drop fell on Goody's face. What should she do? If she did not make haste, she would soon be wet to the skin. Fortunately, there was an old barn down the road in which she could find shelter, and Goody Two-Shoes gathered her skirts about her and took to her heels and ran as if somebody was after her. The owner of the barn had died lately, and the property was to be sold, and there was a lot of loose hay on the floor which had not yet been taken away. Goody Two-Shoes cuddled down in the soft hay, glad of a chance to rest her weary limbs and quite out of breath with her long run. And just then down rattled the rain, the thunder roared, the lightning flashed, and the old barn trembled, and so did Goody Two-Shoes. She had not been there long before she heard footsteps, and 3 men came into the barn for shelter. The hay was piled up between her and them, so they could not see her, and thinking they were alone, they spoke quite loudly. they were plotting to rob Squire Truman, who lived in the great house in Marjorie's village, and were to break in and steal all they could that very night. This was quite enough for Goody Two-Shoes. She waited for nothing, but dashed out of the barn and ran through rain and mud till she came to the squire's house. He was at dinner with some friends, and anyone else but Goody would have found it difficult to gain admission to him. But she was well known to the servants, and was so kind and obliging that even the big fat butler could not refuse to do her bidding, and went and told the squire that Goody Two-Shoes wished very much to see him. So the squire asked his friends to excuse him for a moment, and came out and said, "Well, Goody Two-Shoes, my good girl, what is it?"
"Oh, sir," she replied, "if you do not take care, you will be robbed and murdered this very night."
Then she told all she had heard the men say while she was in the barn. The squire saw there was not a moment to lose, so he went back and told his friends the news he had heard. They all said they would stay and help him take the thieves. So the lights were put out to make it appear as if all the people in the house were in bed, and servants and all kept a close watch both inside and outside. Sure enough, at about 1 o'clock in the morning, the 3 men came creeping up to the house with a dark lantern and the tools to break in with. Before they were aware, 6 men sprang out on them and held them fast. The thieves struggled in vain to get away. They were locked in an outhouse until daylight, when a cart came and took them off to jail. They were afterwards sent out of the country, where they had to work in chains on the roads, and it's said that one of them behaved so well that he was pardoned and went to live in Australia, where he became a rich man. The other 2 went from bad to worse, and it's likely that they came to some dreadful end, for sin never goes unpunished. But to return to Goody Two-Shoes. One day, as she was walking through the village, she saw some wicked boys with a raven, at which they were going to throw stones. To stop this cruel sport, she gave the boys a penny for the raven, and brought the bird home with her. She gave him the name of Ralph, and he proved to be a very clever creature indeed. They taught him to spell and to read, and he was so fond of playing with the large letters that the children called them Ralph's alphabet. Some days after Goody had met with the raven, she was passing through a field when she saw some naughty boys who had taken a pigeon and tied a string to its legs in order to let it fly and draw it back again when they pleased. Goody could not bear to see anything tortured like that. So she bought the pigeon from the boys and taught him how to spell and read. But he could not talk, and as Ralph the raven took the large letters, Peter the pigeon took care of the small ones. Mrs. Williams, who lived in Marjorie's village, kept school and taught little ones their ABCs. She was now old and feeble, and wanted to give up this important trust. This being known to Sir William Dove, he asked Mrs. Williams to examine Goody Two-Shoes and see if she was not clever enough for the office. This was done, and Mrs. Williams reported that little Marjorie was the best scholar and had the best heart of anyone she had ever examined. All the country had a great opinion of Mrs. Williams, and this report made them think highly of Miss Marjorie, as we must now call her. So Marjorie Meanwell was now a schoolmistress, and a capital one she made. The children all loved her, for she was never weary of making plans for their happiness. The room in which she taught was large and lofty, and there was plenty of fresh air in it, and as she knew that children liked to move about, she placed her sets of letters all around the school, so that everyone was obliged to get up to find a letter or spell a word when it came their turn. This exercise not only kept the children in good health, but fixed the letters firmly in their minds. The neighbours were very good to her, and one of them made her a present of a little skylark, whose early morning song told the lazy birds and girls that it was time they were out of bed. Some time after this, a poor lamb lost its dam, and the farmer, being about to kill it, she bought it off him, and brought it home to play with the children. Soon after this, a present was made to Miss Marjorie of a dog, and as he was always in good humour and always jumping about, the children gave him the name of Jumper. It was his duty to guard the door, and no one could go out or come in without leave from his mistress. Marjorie was so wise and good that some foolish people accused her of being a witch, and she was taken to court and tried before the judge. She soon proved that she was a most sensible woman, and Sir Charles Jones was so pleased with her that he offered her a large sum of money to take care of his family and educate his daughter. At first she refused, but afterwards went and behaved so well and was so kind and tender that Sir Charles would not permit her to leave the house, and soon after made her an offer of marriage. The neighbours came in crowds to the wedding, and all were glad that one who had been such a good girl and had grown up such a good woman was to become a grand lady. Just as the clergyman had opened the book, a gentleman, richly dressed, ran into the church and cried, "Stop! Stop!" Great alarm was felt, especially by the bride and groom, with whom he said he wished to speak privately. Sir Charles stood motionless with surprise, and the bride fainted away in the stranger's arms, for this richly dressed gentleman turned out to be little Tommy Meanwell, who had just come from sea, where he had made a large fortune. Sir Charles and Lady Jones lived very happily together, and the great lady did not forget the children, but was just as good to them as she had always been. She was also kind and good to the poor and the sick, and a friend to all who were in distress. Her life was a great blessing, and her death the greatest calamity that ever took place in the neighbourhood where she lived, and was known as Goody Two-Shoes. End of Goody Two-Shoes by Anonymous. Read by Craig Franklin.
Jack and the Beanstalk by Logan Marshall. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Chad Horner. Jack was an idle, lazy boy who would do no work to support his widowed mother, and at last they both came to such poverty that the poor woman had to sell her cow to buy food to keep them from starving. She sent Jack to market with the cow, telling him to be sure and sell it for a good price. As Jack was going along the road to market, he met a butcher. The butcher offered to buy the cow in exchange for a hatful of coloured beans. Jack thought the beans looked very pretty, and he was glad to be saved the long hot walk to market. So he struck the bargain on the spot and went back to his mother with the beans, while the butcher went off with the cow. But the poor widow was very disappointed. She scolded her son for an idle, lazy, good-for-nothing boy, and flung the beans out of the window in a passion. Now the beans were magic beans, and the next morning when Jack awoke, he found some of them had taken root in the night, and had grown so tall that they reached right up into the sky. Jack was full of wonder and curiosity, and being fond of adventure and excitement, he set out at once to climb the beanstalk, to see what was up at the top of it. And he climbed, 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 until at last he climbed right up to the very tip-top of the beanstalk. Then he found himself standing in a strange country. In the distance he could see a big castle, and as he was hot and tired with his long climb, he thought he would go and ask for something to eat and drink. He had not gone very far before he met a fairy, who told him that the castle belonged to a wicked ogre, who had killed and eaten a great number of people. "It was he who killed your father," she said, "and it is your duty to do your utmost to destroy the wicked monster. Go now and see what you can do. If you can carry off any of his treasures, you are at liberty to do so, for none of them really belongs to him. He has taken them all by force from the people whom he robbed and killed." Jack was delighted at the idea of this adventure, and set off in high spirits towards the castle. The castle was farther off than he had thought, and by the time he reached the gates it was so late that he made up his mind to ask for a night's lodging. There was a woman standing in the doorway, but when Jack made his request she was very frightened and said, "Indeed, I dare not take you in and give you food and lodging. My husband is an ogre who lives on human flesh. If he were to find you here he would think nothing of eating you up in 3 mouthfuls. I advise you to go away at once before he comes home." But when she saw how tired and hungry Jack really was, she took him into the house and gave him plenty to eat and drink. While Jack was eating his food in the kitchen there came a loud knocking at the door. The ogre's wife, in a great flurry, hid Jack in the oven, and then hurried to let her husband in. Jack peeped through the oven door and saw a terrible-looking ogre, who came stamping into the kitchen and said in a voice like thunder, "Wife, I smell fresh meat." "It is only the people you are fattening in the dungeon," said the wife. So the ogre sat down and ate his supper. After supper he commanded his wife to bring him his money bags. He then began to count his money, thousands and thousands of pieces of gold and silver. Jack wished he could take some of this money home to his mother, and presently when the ogre fell asleep he crept out of his hiding place and, hoisting the bags upon his shoulder, slipped quietly away with them. The ogre was snoring so loudly that it sounded like the wind in the chimney on a stormy night, so he never heard the little noise Jack made. Jack got safely away and escaped down the beanstalk. His mother was overjoyed to see him, for she had been very anxious about him when he did not come home the night before, and she was delighted with the bags of money, which were enough to keep them in comfort and luxury for some time. For many months Jack and his mother lived happily together, but after a while the money came to an end, and Jack made up his mind to climb the beanstalk again and carry off some more to the ogre's treasures. So one morning he got up early, put on a different suit of clothes, so that the ogre's wife should not recognize him, and set out to climb the beanstalk. And he climbed, 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 until at last he climbed to the very top and found himself in the ogre's country again. When he reached the castle, the ogre's wife was again standing in the doorway, but when Jack asked for a night's lodging, she said she dared not give him one, for only a few months before she had taken in a poor boy who seemed half dead with fatigue and hunger, and in return for her kindness he had stolen some of her husband's money and run away in the night. But Jack begged so hard that at last she relented. She gave him a good supper and hid him in a closet before her husband came home. Presently there was a great noise outside and heavy footsteps that shook the castle to its foundations. It was the ogre come home. As soon as he entered the kitchen, he sniffed suspiciously and said, "I smell fresh meat." "It is only the crows on the housetops," said his wife. "They have brought home a piece of carrion for their young." After supper the ogre told his wife to fetch his hen. This hen was a very wonderful bird. Whenever the ogre said "lay," she laid an egg of solid gold. Jack thought that if he could only get this wonderful hen to take home to his mother, they would never want any more. So when the ogre fell asleep, as he did after a little while, he came out of the closet and, seizing the hen in his arms, made off with her. The hen squawked, but the ogre's snoring was like the roaring of the sea when the tide is coming in, and Jack got safely down the beanstalk. The hen laid so many golden eggs that Jack and his mother became quite rich and prosperous, and there was really no need for Jack to go again to the ogre's country. But he liked the danger and excitement, and he remembered that the fairy had told him to take as many of the ogre's treasures as he could, and at last, without saying a word to anybody, he started off once more to climb the magic beanstalk. And he climbed, 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 and he climbed until at last he reached the very tip-top and stood in the ogre's country. This time when he reached the castle he began to be afraid that the ogre's wife really would not let him in. Indeed, I dare not," she said. "Twice lately I have given shelter to a wayfaring youth, and each time he stole some of my husband's treasures and made off with them. Now my husband has forbidden me, on pain of instant death, to give food or lodging to any traveller." But Jack pleaded and pleaded, and at last a good-natured woman, moved to pity by his travel-stained appearance, gave way and let him into the castle. When the ogre came home, the wife hid Jack in the copper. As usual, the ogre's first words were, "Wife, wife, I smell fresh meat." And in spite of all his wife could say, he insisted upon searching all round the room. Jack was in a terrible fright whilst he was hunting, but fortunately he forgot to look in the copper, and after a time he sat down to his supper. When supper was over, the ogre told his wife to fetch his harp. Jack peeped out of the copper and saw the harp brought in and set down before the ogre. It was marvellously made, and when the ogre said play, it played the finest music without being touched. Jack was enchanted, for he had never before heard such wonderful music, and he felt that he must have the harp for his own. The ogre was soon lulled to sleep by the sweet sound of the harp, and when he was snoring heavily, Jack crept out of the copper, and taking up the harp was about to make off with it, but the harp was a fairy harp, and it called out loudly, "Master, master, master!" And although the ogre was snoring so noisily that it was like the sound of 100 dragons roaring at once, yet to Jack's dismay and horror he heard the voice of his harp, and starting to his feet with a bellow of anger, rushed after the daring thief. Jack ran faster than he had ever run in his life before, still carrying the precious harp, while the ogre ran after him, shouting and roaring and making such a noise that it sounded like 1,000 thunderstorms all going at once. If he had not drunk so much wine for supper, the ogre must very soon have caught Jack, but as it was, the wine had got into his head, and so he could not run nearly so fast as usual, and Jack reached the beanstalk just in front of him. It was a very close shave. Jack slid down the beanstalk at his top speed, calling at the top of his voice for his mother to fetch him an axe. The ogre came tumbling down the beanstalk after him, but Jack seized the axe and chopped the beanstalk off close to the root. Down came the beanstalk, down came the ogre, and falling headlong into the garden, he was killed on the spot. After this, Jack quite gave up his lazy idle ways, and he and his mother, with the magic hen and the wonderful harp, lived in happiness and prosperity the rest of their lives. End of Jack and the Beanstalk by Logan Marshall. Jesus Conquers Death by Henry A. Sherman and Charles Foster Kent. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Chad Horner. When the Sabbath was over, Mary of Magdala, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices to embalm Jesus. Soon after sunrise on the first day of the week, they went to the tomb, and they said to one another, "Who will roll away the stone for us from the door?" But they found that the stone, although very large, had been rolled to one side. On entering the tomb they saw a young man in a white robe sitting on the right, and they trembled and were afraid. But he said to them, "Do not be afraid. You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. See the place where he was laid. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you into Galilee, where you will see him as he told you." Then they remembered Jesus' words, and returning from the tomb they told these things to the 11 disciples and to all the others. But to them the story seemed to be nonsense, and they were not believed. Peter, however, ran to the tomb, but when he looked in, he saw only the linen bandages, and he went home wondering what had happened. But Mary of Magdala stood weeping outside the tomb. As she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb and saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and the other at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. They said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said, "Because they have taken away my master, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. "Woman," said he, "why are you weeping? For whom are you looking?" Supposing that he was the gardener, she said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned to him and cried out, "Master." Jesus said, "Do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. But go to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God." Mary went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Master," and to tell them what he had said to her. End of Jesus Conquers Death by Henry A. Sherman and Charles Foster Kent. Jesus Heals the Sick by Henry A. Sherman and Charles Foster Kent. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Chad Horner. Jesus and his disciples entered Capernaum, and on the next Sabbath he went into the synagogue and began to teach. And the people were astonished at his teaching, for he taught them as one who had authority, and not as the scribes. In their synagogue that day was a man under the power of an unclean spirit, who cried out, "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know you are God's Holy One." But Jesus reproved the unclean spirit, saying, "Be still and come out of him." Then the unclean spirit, after convulsing the man, came out of him with a loud cry. The people were so astonished that they began to ask one another, "What is this? Is it a new teaching? With authority he commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." So the news about Jesus spread at once, in every direction, all through the country about Galilee. After leaving the synagogue they were straight to the house of Simon and Andrew, and James and John went with them. The mother of Simon's wife was ill in bed with a fever, so at once they told Jesus about her. He went to her and, taking her by the hand, lifted her up. Then the fever left her, and she began to wait upon them. In the evening, after the sun had set, they brought to him all who were sick or under the control of evil spirits, until all the people of the city were gathered at the door. He healed many who were sick with different kinds of diseases, and cast out many evil spirits, but would not let them speak, because they knew who he was. One day a leper came to him, and on bended knees begged him, "If you will, you can make me clean." Feeling sorry for him, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said, "I will be cleansed." At once the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Then Jesus, after strictly warning him, sent him away with the command, "See that you do not say a word to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer what Moses commanded as proof to them that you are clean." But the man went away and began to tell everyone about it, so that Jesus could no longer enter a city openly, but had to stay outside in lonely places, and people from everywhere came to see him. End of Jesus Heals the Sick by Henry A. Sherman and Charles Foster Kent.
King John and the Abbott, from 50 Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Wayne Cooke. Part 1. The Three Questions. There once was a king of England whose name was John. He was a bad king, for he was harsh and cruel to his people, and so long as he could have his own way, he did not care what became of other folks. He was the worst king that England ever had. Now, there was in the town of Canterbury a rich old abbot who lived in a grand style in a great house called the Abbey. Every day 100 noblemen sat down with him to dine, and 50 brave knights, in fine velvet coats and gold chains, waited upon him at his table. When King John heard of the way in which the abbot lived, he made up his mind to put a stop to it. So he sent for the old man to come and see him. "How now, my good abbot?" he said. "I hear that you keep a far better house than I. How dare you do such a thing? Don't you know that no man in the land ought to live better than the king? And I tell you that no man shall." "O king," said the abbot, "I beg to say that I am spending nothing but what is my own. I hope that you will not think ill of me for making things pleasant for my friends and the brave knights who are with me." "Think ill of you?" said the king. "How can I help but think ill of you? All that there is in this broad land is mine by right, and how do you dare to put me to shame by living in a grander style than I? One would think that you were trying to be king in my place." "Oh, do not say so," said the abbot, "for I—" "Not another word," cried the king. "Your fault is plain, and unless you can answer me 3 questions, your head shall be cut off, and all your riches shall be mine." "I will try to answer them, O king," said the abbot. "Well, then," said King John, "as I sit here with my crown of gold on my head, you must tell me within a day just how long I shall live. Secondly, you must tell me how soon I shall ride round the whole world. And lastly, you shall tell me what I think." "O king," said the abbot, "these are deep, odd questions. I cannot answer them just now, but if you'll give me 2 weeks to think about them, I will do the best I can." "2 weeks you shall have," said the king. "But if you then fail to answer me, you shall lose your head, and all your lands shall be mine." The abbot went away very sad and in great fear. He rode first to Oxford. Here there was a great school called a university, and he wanted to see if any of the wise professors could help him. But they shook their heads and said that there was nothing about King John in any of their books. Then the abbot rode down to Cambridge, where there was another university, but not one of the teachers in that great school could help him. At last, sad and sorrowful, he rode toward home to bid his friends and his brave knights good-bye, for now he had not a week to live. Part 2. The 3 Answers. As the abbot was riding up the lane which led to his grand house, he met his shepherd going to the fields. "Welcome home, good master," cried the shepherd. "What news do you bring us from great King John?" Sad news, said the abbot, and then he told him all that had happened. Cheer up, good master," said the shepherd. "Have you never yet heard that a fool may teach a wise man wit? I think I can help you out of your trouble." "You help me?" cried the abbot. "But how?" "Well," answered the shepherd, "you know that everybody says that I look just like you, and that I have sometimes been mistaken for you. So lend me your servants and your horse and your gown, and I will go up to London and see the king. If nothing else can be done, I can at least die in your place." "My good shepherd," said the abbot, "you are very, very kind, and I have a mind to let you try your plan. But if the worst comes to worst, you shall not die for me. I will die for myself." So the shepherd got ready to go at once. He dressed himself with great care. Over his shepherd's coat he threw the abbot's long gown, and he borrowed the abbot's cap and golden staff. When all was ready, no one in the world would have thought that he was not the great man himself. Then he mounted his horse, and with a great train of servants set out for London. Of course the king did not know him. "Welcome, Sir Abbot," he said. "It is a good thing that you have come back, but, prompt as you are, if you fail to answer my 3 questions, you shall lose your head." "I am ready to answer them, O king," said the shepherd. Indeed," said the king, and he laughed to himself. "Well then, answer my first question. How long shall I live? Come, you must tell me to the very day." "You shall live," said the shepherd, "until the day you die, and not one day longer. And you shall die when you take your last breath, not one moment before." The king laughed. "You're witty, I see," he said, "but we shall let that pass, and say that your answer is right. And now tell me how soon I may ride round the world." "You must ride with the sun," said the shepherd, "and you must ride with the sun until it rises again the next morning. And as soon as you do that, you will find that you have ridden round the world in 24 hours. The king laughed again. "Indeed," he said, "I did not think that it could be done so soon. You are not only witty, but you are wise, and we will let this answer pass. And now comes my third and last question. What do I think?" "That is an easy question," said the shepherd. "You think that I am the Abbot of Canterbury. But to tell you the truth, I am only his poor shepherd, and I have come to beg your pardon for him and for me." And with that he threw off his long gown. The king laughed loud and long. "A merry fellow you are," said he, "and you shall be the Abbot of Canterbury in your master's place." "O king, that cannot be," said the shepherd, "for I neither read nor write." "Very well, then," said the king, "I will give you something else to pay you for this merry joke. I will give you 4 pieces of silver every week as long as you live. And when you get home, you may tell the old abbot that you have brought him a free pardon from King John." End of King John and the Abbot, from 50 Famous Stories Retold by James Baldwin.
The Land of the Blue Flower by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Part 1. The Land of the Blue Flower was not called by that name until the tall, strong, beautiful King Amor came down from his castle on the mountain crag and began to reign. Before that time it was called King Moradeth's Land, and as the first King Moradeth had been a fierce and cruel king, this seemed a gloomy name. A few weeks before Amor was born, his weak, selfish boy-father, whose name was King Moradeth also, had been killed while hunting, and his fair mother with the clear eyes died when he was but a few hours old. But early in that day she sent for her venerable friend and teacher, who was said to be the oldest and wisest man in the world, and who long ago had fled to a cave in the mountains, that he might see no more of the famine and disorder and hatred in the country spread out on the plains below. He was a marvelous old man, almost a giant in size, and having great blue eyes like deep sea water. They, too, were clear eyes like the fair queen's. They seemed to see all things, and to hold in their depths no single thought which was not fine and great. The people were a little afraid of him when they saw him go striding majestically through their streets. They had no name for him but the Ancient One. The lovely queen drew aside the embroidered coverlet of her gold and ivory bed and showed him the tiny baby sleeping by her side. "He was born a king," she said. "No one can help him but you." The Ancient One looked down at him. "He has long limbs and strong ones. He will make a great king," he said. "Give him to me." The queen held out the little newborn one in her arms. "Take him away quickly before he hears the people quarreling at the palace gate," she said. "Take him to the castle on the mountain crag. Keep him there until he is old enough to come down and be king. When the sun sinks behind the clouds, I shall die, but if he is with you, he will learn what kings should know." The Ancient One took the child, folded him in his long gray robe, and strode majestically through the palace gates, through the ugly city and out over the plains to the mountain. When he began to climb its steep sides, the sun was setting and casting a golden rose color over the big rocks and the wild flowers and bushes which grew on every side, so that there seemed no path to be found. But the Ancient One knew his way anywhere in the world without a path to guide him. He climbed, and little King Amor slept soundly in the folds of his gray robe. He reached the summit at last, and pushed his way through a jungle of twisted vines starred all over with pale, sweet-scented buds. He stood looking at the castle which was set on the very topmost crag, and looked out over the mountain's edge at the sea and the sky and the spreading plains below. The sky was dark blue now and lit by myriad stars, and all was so still that the world seemed thousands of miles away, and ugliness and squalor and people who quarreled seemed things which were not true. A sweet, cool wind blew about them as the Ancient One took King Amor from the folds of his gray robe and laid him on the carpet of scented moss. "The stars are very near," he said. "Waken, young king, and see how near they are, and know they are your brothers. Your brother the wind is bringing to you the breath of your brothers the trees. You are at home." Then King Amor opened his eyes, and when he saw the stars in the blue darkness above him, he smiled, and though he was not yet a whole day old, he threw up his small hand, and it touched his forehead. "Like a king and a soldier he salutes them," said the Ancient One, though he does not know he did it. The castle was huge and splendid, though it had been deserted for 100 years. For 3 generations the royal owners had not cared to look out on the world from high places. They knew nothing of the wind and the trees and the stars. They lived on the plains in their cities, and hunted and rioted and levied heavy taxes on their wretched people. And the castle had lived through its summers and winters alone. It had battlements and towers which stood out clear against the sky, and there was a great banquet hall and chambers for hundreds of guests, and rooms for 1,000 men-at-arms, and the courtyard was big enough to hold a tournament in. In the midst of its space and splendor the little King Amor lived alone, but for the companionship of the Ancient One, and a servant as old as himself. But they knew a secret which had kept them young in spite of the years they had passed through. They knew that they were the brothers of all things in the world, and that the man who never knows an angered or evil thought can never know a foe. They were strong and straight and wise, and the wildest creature stopped to give them greeting as it passed, and they understood its language when it spoke. Because they held no dark thoughts in their minds, they knew no fear, and because they knew no fear, the wild creatures knew none, and the speech of each was clear to the other. Each morning they went out on the battlements at dawn to see the splendid sun rise slowly out of the purple sea. One of the very first things the child Amor remembered in his life, and he remembered it always, was a dawning day when the Ancient One waked him gently, and folding him in his long gray robe, carried him up the winding and narrow stone stairway, until at last they stepped forth on the top of the huge castle which seemed to the little creature to be so high that it was quite close to the wonderful sky itself. "The sun is going to rise and wake the world," said the Ancient One. "Young king, watch the wonder of it." Amor lifted his little head and looked. He was only just old enough to be beginning to understand things, but he loved the Ancient One and all he said and did. Far below the mountain crag lay the sea. In the night, while it slept, it had looked dark blue or violet, but now it was slowly changing its color. The sky was changing too. It was growing paler and paler. Next it grew faintly brighter, so did the sea. Then a slight flush crept over land and water, and all the small floating clouds were rosy pink. King Amor smiled because birds' voices were to be heard in the trees and bushes, and something golden bright was rising out of the edge of the ocean, and sparkling light danced on the waves. It rose higher and grew so dazzling and wonderful that he threw out his little hand with a shout of joy. The next moment he started back because there rose near him a loud whir and beating of powerful wings as a great bird flew out of a crag nearby and soared high into the radiant morning heavens. "It is the eagle who was our neighbor," said the Ancient One. "He has awakened and gone to give his greeting to the sun." And as the little king sat upright, enraptured, he saw that from the dazzling brightness at the edge of the world there leaped forth a ball of living gold and fire, and even he knew that the sun had risen. "At every day's dawn it leaps forth like that," said the Ancient One. "Let us watch together, and I will tell you stories of it." So they sat by the battlement, and the stories were told. They were stories of the small grains lying hid in the dark earth, waiting for the golden heat of the sun to draw them forth into life until they covered the tilled fields with waving wheat to make bread for the world. They were stories of the seeds of fair flowers warmed and ripened until they burst into scented blossoms. They were stories of the roots of trees and the rich sap drawn upward by the heat until great branches and thick leafage waved in the summer air. They were stories of men, women, and children walking with light step and glad because of the gold of the sun. Every day it warms, every day it draws, every day it ripens and gives life, and there are many who forget the wonder of it. Lift your head high as you walk, young king, and often look upward. Never forget the sun. At every dawning they rose and saw together the wonder of the day, and the first time the sky was heavy with gray clouds and the sun did not leap upward from behind the edge of the world, the Ancient One said another thing. "The burning gold is behind the lowering gray and purple. The clouds are heavy with soft rain. When they break, they will drop it in showers or splendid storms, and the thirsty earth will drink it up. The grains will drink it, and the seed and the roots, and the world will be joyous and rich with fresh life. The springs will bubble up like crystal, and the brooks will rush babbling through the green of the forest. The drinking places for the cattle will be full and clear, and men and women will feel rested and cool. Lift your head high when you walk, young king, and often look upward. Never forget the clouds." So, hearing these things every day, King Amor learned the meaning of both sun and clouds, and loved and felt himself brother to both. The first time he remembered seeing a storm, the Ancient One took him to the battlements again, and together they watched the dark clouds pour down their floods while their purple was riven by the dazzling lances of the lightning, and the thunder rolled and crashed and seemed to rend asunder things no human eye could see, and the wind roared round the castle on the mountain crag and beat against its towers, and tossed the branches of the hugest trees, and whirled the rain in sheets over the land. And King Amor stood erect and strong like some little soldier, though he wondered where the small birds were and if the eagle were in his nest. Through all the tumult the Ancient One stood still. He looked taller than ever in his long gray robe, and his strange eyes were deep as the sea. At last he said in a slow, calm voice, "This is the voice of power men know not. No man has yet quite understood, though it seems to speak. Hearken to it. Let your soul stand silent. Listen, young king. Hold your head high as you walk, and often look upward. Never forget the storm." So the king learned to love the storm and be one with it, knowing no fear. But perhaps it might be because he had been laid on the scented moss and had, without knowing it, saluted them on the first night of his life. He felt nearest to, and loved most, his brothers the stars. Every fair night through the king's earliest years, the Ancient One carried him to the battlements and let him fall asleep beneath the shining myriads. But first he would walk about bearing him in his arms, or sit with him in the splendid silence, sometimes relating wonders to him in a low voice, sometimes uttering no word, only looking calmly into the high vault above, as if the stars spoke to him and told him of perfect peace. "When a man looks long at them," he said, "he grows calm and forgets small things. They answer his questions and show him that his earth is only one of the million worlds. Hold your soul still and look upward often, and you will understand their speech. Never forget the stars. Part 2. So, as the child king grew day by day, the world seemed to grow fuller and fuller of wonders and beauties. There were the sun and the moon, the storm and the stars, the straight falling lances of rain, the springing of the growing things, the flight of the eagle, the songs and nests of small bird creatures, the changing seasons, and the work of the great brown earth giving its harvests and its fruits. All these wonders in one world, and you, a man, upon it, said the Ancient One. Hold high your head when you walk, young king, and often look upward. Never forget one marvel among them all. He forgot nothing. He lived looking out on all things from great, clear, joyous eyes. Upon his mountain crag he never heard a paltry or unbeautiful word, or knew of the existence of unfriendliness or baseness in thought. As soon as he was old enough to go out alone, he roamed about the great mountain, and feared neither storm nor wild beasts. Shaggy-maned lions and their mates drew near and fawned on him as their kind had fawned on young Adam in the Garden of Eden. There had never passed through his mind the thought that they were not his friends. He did not know that there were men who killed their wild brothers. In the huge courtyard of the castle he learned to ride and to perform great feats of strength. Because he had not learned to be afraid, he never feared that he could not do a thing. He grew so strong and beautiful that when he was 10 years old, he was as tall as a youth of 16, and when he was 16, he was already like a young giant. This was because he had been brother to the storm, and had lived close to the strength and splendor of the stars. Only once, when he was a boy of 12, a strange and painful thing happened to him. From his kingdom in the plains below, there had been sent to him a beautiful young horse which had been bred for him. Never had so magnificent an animal been born in the royal stable. When he was brought into the courtyard, the boy king's eyes shone with joy. He spent the greater part of the morning in exercising and leaping him over barriers. The Ancient One in his tower chamber heard his shouts of exultation and encouragement. At last the king went out to try him on the winding mountain road. When he returned, he went at once to the tower chamber to the Ancient One, who, when he raised his eyes from his great book, looked at him gravely. "Let us climb to the battlements," the boy said. "We must talk together." So they went, and when they stood looking out on the world below, the curving turquoise sky above them, the eyes of the Ancient One were still more grave. "Tell me, young king." "Something strange has happened," King Amor answered. "I have felt something I have not felt before. I was riding my horse around the field on the plateau, and he saw something which he refused to pass. It was a young leopard watching us from a tree. My horse reared and snorted. He would not listen to me, but backed and wheeled around. I tried in vain to persuade him, and suddenly, when I saw I could not make him obey me, this strange new feeling rushed through all my body. I got hot, and I knew my face was scarlet. My heart beat faster, and my blood seemed to boil in my veins. I shouted out harsh, ugly sounds. I forgot that all things are brothers. I lifted my hand and clenched it, and struck my horse again and again. I loved him no longer. I felt that he no longer loved me. I am hot and wearied and heavy from it still. I feel no more joy. Was it pain I felt? I have never felt pain, and I do not know. Was it pain?" "It was a worse thing," answered the Ancient One. "It was anger. When a man is overcome by anger, he has a poisoned fever. He loses his strength. He loses his power over himself and over others. He throws away time in which he might have gained the end he most desires. There is no time for anger in the world." So King Amor learned the uselessness of anger, for they sat long upon the battlements while the Ancient One told him how its poison worked in the veins and weakened the strongest man until he was made a fool. That night Amor lay under the sky, looking at his myriad brothers, the stars, and drawing calm from them. If you lie through the night upon the battlements and think only of the stillness and the stars, you will forget your anger, and its poison will die away. If you put into your mind a beautiful thought, it will take the place of the evil one. There is no room for darkness in the mind of he who thinks only of the stars. This had been said to him by the Ancient One. Upon the plateau at the foot of the crag on which the castle stood, there were marvelous walled gardens. The sad young queen of the first King Mordreth had planted them, and after her death they had been left to run wild. Since the baby King Amor had been brought to the mountain top, the Ancient One and his servitor had made them bloom again. As soon as he was old enough to hold a small spade, Amor had worked in the beds. All things grew for him as if his touch were a spell. Birds and bees and butterflies flocked round him as he labored. He knew what the bees hummed, and where they flew to load themselves with honey. Butterflies lighted upon his hands, and taught him strange things. Birds told him of their travels, and brought him seeds from far countries which he planted in his gardens, and which bloomed into marvelous flowers. A swallow who loved him very much, and who had seen many wonderful lands, once brought him a seed from an emperor's secret garden, which none but 4 of his own slaves had ever seen. These slaves had been born in the garden, and would never leave it while they lived. King Amor planted the seed in a pleasaunce of its own. It grew into the most beautiful blue flower the world had ever known. It was of a blue so pure and exquisitely intense that it was a rapture to look at it. Its blossoms hung from a tall stem, and in its first year it gave 1,000 seeds. Each year Amor planted more flowers, and each year they grew taller and more wonderful and blossomed a longer time. When the summer wind blew, it shook out clouds of delicate fragrance, which sometimes floated down the mountain, until the wretched dwellers in King Mordreth's land forgot their quarrels and misery, and even lifted their heavy heads to inhale it and ask each other what was being done upon the mountain. Each year King Amor gathered the seeds and stored them in an unused tower of his castle. Taller and stronger he grew, and each day wiser and more beautiful. Each plant, each weed, each 4-footed thing, each wind, each star of heaven taught him its wonders and its wisdom. His eyes were so marvelous in their straight-glanced splendor that when he looked at a man, they seemed to read his soul and command its truth to answer him. He was so powerful that he could break an iron bar in 2 pieces with his hands. When he was 20 years old, the Ancient One took him up on the battlements, and giving him a strong glass, told him to look down upon the capital city on the plain and see what was being done there. "I see many people gathered in crowds," Amor said when he had looked for a few moments. "I see bright colors and waving pennants and triumphal arches. It is as if some great ceremony were being prepared for." "The people are making ready for your coronation," said the Ancient One. "Tomorrow you will be led in state down the mountain and acclaimed king. It was to fit you to reign over your kingdom that I taught you to know all the wonders of the world, and have shown you that no thing is useless but folly and dishonoring thought. That which you have learned from your brothers here, you go down the mountain to teach your brothers there. You will see things which are not beautiful, and those which are unclean. But hold your head high when you walk, young king, and never forget the sun, the wind, and the stars." To himself as he looked on, the Ancient One said, "When he stands before them, they will think he is a young god." The next morning a splendid procession wound its glittering way up the mountain road to the castle. There were princes and nobles and chieftains. Rich colors glowed in their attire, and gorgeous banners and pennants waved over them, while music from gold and silver trumpets accompanied them as they rode, and their many followers marched behind. The Ancient One in his long robe of gray stood by King Amor on the broad stone terrace, guarded by its crouching carved lions. "This is your king, O people," he said. And when the people looked, it was as he said it would be. They drew back a little and gazed in fear, and many of the followers fell upon their knees. They thought they saw a beautiful young giant and god, but he was only a splendid and powerful young man who had never known a dark thought and had lived near to his brothers the stars. His horse, adorned with golden trappings, was brought, and he was led down the mountainside, through the gates, into the capital city of his kingdom. He desired that the Ancient One should ride by his side. What he saw as he rode to the place of coronation he had never seen before. Notwithstanding the embroidered silk and velvet hangings decorating the fronts of the rich people's houses, he caught glimpses of filthy side streets, squalid alleys, and tumble-down tenements. He saw forlorn little children scud away like rats into their holes as he drew near, and wretched, vicious-looking men and women fighting with each other for places in the crowd. Sharp, miserable faces peered round corners at him, and nobody smiled, because everyone hated or distrusted his neighbor, and they dreaded and disliked the young king because all the King Mordreths had been evil and selfish, and he was their descendant. When they saw that he was so tall and powerful and carried his handsome head so high, often looking upward, they feared him still more. As their own heads hung down, they never saw anything but the dirt and dust beneath their feet or the quarrels about them, so their minds were full of fears and ugly thoughts, and they at once began to be afraid of him and suspect him of being proud. He could do twice as much evil as the other kings, they said, since he was twice as strong and twice as handsome. It was their nature to first think an evil thought of anything or anybody, and to be afraid of all things at the outset. The princes and nobles who rode in the procession tried to prevent King Amor seeing the wretched-looking people and ill-kept streets. They pointed out the palaces and decorations and beautiful ladies throwing flowers in his path from the balconies. He praised all the splendors and saluted the balconies, looking up with such radiant and smiling eyes that the ladies almost threw themselves after their flowers and cried out that never, never had there been crowned such a beautiful young king before. "Do not look at the rabble, your majesty," the prime minister said. "They are an evil, ill-tempered lot of worthless malcontents and thieves." "I would not look at them," answered King Amor, "if I knew that I could not help them. There is no time to look at dark things if one cannot make them brighter. I look at these because there is something to be done. I do not yet know what." "There is such hatred in their eyes that they will only make you angry, sire," said a handsome young prince who rode near. "There is no time for anger," said Amor, holding his crowned head high. "It is a worthless thing." After sunset there was a great banquet, and after it a great ball, and the courtiers and princes were delighted by the beauty and grace of the new king. He was much brighter and more charming than any of the King Mordreths had been. His laugh was full of gaiety, and the people who stood near him felt happier, though they did not know why. But when the ball was at its height, he stepped into the center of the room and spoke aloud to the splendid company. "I have seen the broad streets and the palaces and all that is beautiful in my capital," he said. "Now I must go to the narrow streets and the dark ones. I must see the miserable people, the cripples, the wretched ones, the drunkards, and the thieves." Everyone clamored and protested. These things they had hidden from him. They said kings should not see them. "I will see them," he said, with a smile which was beautiful and strange. "I go now on foot and unattended except for my friend the Ancient One. Let the ball go on." He strode through the glittering throng with the gray-clad Ancient One at his side. He still wore his crown upon his head because he wished his people to know that their king had come to them. Through dark and loathsome places they went, through narrow streets and back alleys and courts where people scurried away like rats as the gutter children had done in the daytime. King Amor could not have seen them but that he had brought with him a bright lantern and held it up in the air above his high head. The light shining upon his beautiful face and his crown made him look more than ever like a young god and giant, and the people cowered, terrified before him, asking each other what such a king would do to wretches like themselves. But just a few very little children smiled at him, because he was so young and bright and splendid. No one in the black holes and corners could understand why a king should come walking among them on the night of his coronation day. Most of them thought that the next morning he would order them all to be killed and their houses burned, because he would only think of them as vermin. Once, as he passed through a dark court, a madman darted out on his path, shaking his fist. "We hate you!" he cried out. "We hate you!" The dwellers in the court gasped with terror, wondering what would happen. But the tall young king stood holding his lantern above his head and gazing at the madman with deep thought in his eyes. "There is no time for hatred in the world," he said. "There is no time." And then he passed on. The look of deep thought was in his face throughout the hours in which he strode on until he had seen all he had come to see. The next day he rode back up the mountain to his castle on the crag, and when the night fell, he lay out upon the battlements under the sky as he had done on so many nights. The soft wind blew about him as he looked up at the stars. "I do not know, my brothers," he said to them. "Tell me." And he lay silent until the great sweet stillness of the night seemed to fill his soul, and when the stars began to fade, he slept in rapturous peace. The people in his kingdom on the plain waited, wondering what he would do. During the next few days they quarreled and hated each other more than ever. The rich ones because they all wanted to gain his favor, and each was jealous of the other. The poor ones because they were afraid of him, and each man feared that his neighbor would betray the things he had done in the past. Only two boys working together in a field, having stopped to wrangle and fight, one of them suddenly stood still remembering something, and said a strange thing in a strange voice. "There is no time for anger. There is no time." And as he fell to work again, his companion did the same, and when they had finished their task of weeding, they talked about the thing and remembered that when they had quarreled the day before, they had not finished their task at all, and had not been paid, and had gone home sore from the blows they had given each other, and had had no supper. "No, there is no time," they decided. At the beginning of the following week there were rumors that a strange law had been made, the strangest ever known in the world. It was something about a blue flower. What had flowers to do with laws, or what had laws to do with flowers? People quarreled about what the meaning of such a law might be. Those who thought first of evil things and fears began to say that in rich people's gardens was to be planted a blue flower, whose perfume would poison all the poor. The only ones who did not quarrel were the two boys and their friends, who had already begun to make a sort of password of "There is no time for anger." One of them, who was clever, added a new idea to the saying. "There is no time for fear," he cried out in the field. "Let us go on with our work." And they finished their task early and played games. At last, one morning it was made known that the new king was to give a feast in the open air to all the people. It was to be on the plain outside the city, and he himself was going to proclaim to them the law of the blue flower. "Now we shall know the worst," growled and shivered the afraid ones as they shuffled their way to the plain, and the boys who used the password heard them. "There is no time to think of the worst," shouted the clever one at the top of his voice. "There is no time. We shall be late for the feast." And a number of people actually turned to listen, because there was a high, strong, gay sound in his voice such as had never been heard in King Mordred's land before. The plain was covered in thick green grass, and beautiful spreading trees grew on it. There was a richly draped platform for King Amor's gold and ivory chair, but when the people gathered about, he stood up before them, a beautiful young giant with eyes like fixed stars and head held high. And he read his law in a voice which, wonderful to relate, was heard by every man, woman, and child, even by the little cripple crouching alone in the grass on the very outskirts of the crowd, and not expecting to hear or see anything. This is what he read. "In my pleasaunce on the mountain top there grows a blue flower. One of my brothers, the birds, brought me its seed from an emperor's hidden garden. It is as beautiful as the sky at dawn. It has a strange power. It dispels evil fortune and the dark thoughts which bring it. There is no time for dark thoughts. There is no time for evil. Listen to my law. Tomorrow, seeds will be given to every man, woman, and child in my kingdom, even to the newborn. Every man, woman, and child, even the newborn, is commanded by the law to plant and feed and watch over the blue flower. It is the work of each to make it grow. The mother of the newborn can hold its little hand and make it drop the seeds into the earth. As the child grows, she must show it the green shoots when they pierce the brown soil. She must babble to it of its blue flower. By the time it is pleased by color, it will love the blossoms, and the spell of happiness and good fortune will begin to work for it. It is not one person here and there who must plant the flower, but each and every one. To those who have not land about them, all land is free. You may plant by the roadside, in a cranny of a wall, in an old box or glass or tub, in any bare space in any man's field or garden. But each must plant his seeds and watch over and feed them. Next year, when the blue flower blossoms, I shall ride through my kingdom and bestow my rewards. This is my law. What will befall if some of us do not make them grow? Groaned some of the afraid ones. There is no time to think of that, shouted the boy who was clever. Plant them! When the Prime Minister and his followers told the king that larger and stronger prisons must be built for the many criminals, and that heavier taxes must be laid upon the people to rescue the country from poverty, his answer to them was, "Wait until the blooming of the blue flower." In a short time, everyone was working in the open air, digging in the soil, tiny children as well as men and women. Drunkards and thieves and idlers who had never worked before came out of their dark holes and corners into the light of the sun. It was not a hard thing to plant a few flower seeds, and because the King Amor looked so much more powerful than other men, and had eyes so wonderful and commanding, they did not know what punishment he would invent for them and were afraid to disobey him. But somehow, after they had worked in the sweet-scented earth for a while and had seen others working, the light of the sun and the freshness of the air made them feel in better humor. The wind blew away their evil fancies and their headaches, and because there was so much talk and wondering about the magic of the blue flower, they became interested and wanted to see what it would do for them when it blossomed. Scarcely any of them had ever tried to make a flower grow before, and they gradually thought of it a great deal. There was less quarreling because conversation with neighbors all about a blue flower gave no reason for hard words. The worst and idlest were curious about it, and every one tried experiments of his own. The children were delighted and actually grew happy and rosy over their digging and watering and caretaking. Gradually, all sorts of curious things happened. People who were growing blue flowers began to keep the ground around them in order. They did not like to see bits of paper and rubbish lying about, so they cleared them away. One quite new thing which occurred was that sometimes people even helped each other a little. Cripples and those who were weak actually found that there were stronger ones who would do things for them when their backs ached, and it was hard to carry water or dig up weeds. No one in King Mordred's land had ever helped another before. The boy who was clever did more than all the rest. He gathered together all the children he could and formed them into a band using the passwords. In time, it became quite like a little army. They called themselves the Band of the Blue Flower, and each boy and girl was bound to remember the passwords and apply them to all they did. So, often, when a number of people were together and things began to go wrong, a clear young voice would cry out somewhere like a silver battle cry, "There is no time for anger!" or "There is no time for hate!" or "There is no time to fret! There is no time!" Among the great and rich people also singular things came to pass. Those who had wasted their days loitering or rioting were obliged to get up in the morning to work in their gardens, and finding that exercise and fresh air improved their health and spirits, they began to like it. Court ladies found it good for their complexions and tempers. Busy merchants discovered that it made their heads clearer. Ambitious students found that after an hour spent evening and morning over their blue flower beds, they could study twice as long without fatigue. The children of the princes and nobles became so full of work and talk of their soil and their seeds that they quite forgot to squabble and be jealous of each other's importance at court. Never in one story could it be told how many unusual, interesting, and wonderful things occurred in the once gloomy King Mordred's land, just because every person in it, rich and poor, old and young, good and bad, had to plant and care for and live every day of life with a blue flower. Oh, the corners and crannies and queer places it was planted in, and oh, the thrill of enjoyment everywhere when the first tender green shoots thrust their way through the earth, and the wave of excitement which passed over the whole land when the first buds showed themselves. By that time, everyone was so interested that even the afraid ones had forgotten to ask each other what King Amor would do to them if they had no blue flower. Somehow, people had gained courage, and they knew the blue flower would grow. And they knew there was no time to stop working while they worried and said, suppose it didn't. There was no time. Sometimes the young king was on the mountaintop with the wind and the eagle and the stars, and sometimes he was in his place in the city, but he was always working and thinking for his people. He was not seen by the people, however, until a splendid summer day came when it was proclaimed by heralds in the streets that he would begin his journey through the land by riding through the capital city to see the blossoming of the blue flowers, and there would be a feast once more upon the plain. It was a wonderful day. The air was full of golden light, and the sky of such a blueness as had never been seen before. Out of the palace gates he rode, and he wore his crown, and his eyes were more brilliant than the jewels in it, and his smile was more radiant than a sunrise as he looked about him. For every breath he drew in was fragrant, every ugly place was hidden, and every squalid corner filled with beauty, for it seemed as if the whole world were waving with blue flowers. Tumble-down houses and fences were covered with them, because some of them climbed like vines. Neglected fields and gardens had been made neat so that they would grow. Rubbish and dirt had been cleaned away to make room for clumps and patches of them. You could not grow the blue flower among dirt and disorder, any more than you could grow it while you were spending your time in drinking and quarreling. By the roadsides, in courts, in windows, in cracks, in walls, in broken places in roofs, in great people's gardens, on the window-sills, or about the doorways of poor people's hovels, fair and fragrant and waving grew the blue flower. Where it waved, there was no room for dirt and rubbish, and suddenly even the dullest people began to see that the face of the whole land was changed, as if by some strange magic, and the whole population seemed changed with it. Everybody looked fresher and more cheerful. People had actually learned to smile and to keep themselves clean, and there was not one who was not healthier. They had, in fact, been noticing this for some time, and they had said to each other that the power of the blue flower, of which the king had spoken, was beginning to work. The children had grown gay and rosy, and the boy who was clever and all his companions had found time to earn themselves new clothes, because they had never forgotten their passwords. All the farmers wanted them to work in their fields, because they said there was no time to idle, no time to fight, no time to play evil tricks. On the king rode, and on and on and on, and the farther he went the more splendid and joyous grew his smile. But at no time during the day was it more beautiful than when he met the little cripple who had sat on the outside of the crowd on the first feast day, not expecting to see or hear anything. The cripple lived in a tiny hovel on the edge of the city, and when the glittering procession drew near it, the small patch of garden was quite bare and had not a blue flower in it, and the little cripple was sitting huddled upon his broken doorstep, sobbing softly with his face hidden in his arms. King Amor drew up his white horse and looked at his bare garden. "What has happened here?" he said. "This garden has not been neglected. It has been dug and kept free of weeds, but my law has been broken. There is no blue flower." Then the little cripple got up trembling, and hobbled through his rickety gate, and threw himself down upon the earth before the king's white horse, sobbing hopelessly and heartbrokenly. "O king," he cried, "I am only a cripple, and small, and I can easily be killed. I have no flowers at all. When I opened my package of seeds, I was so glad that I forgot the wind was blowing, and suddenly a great gust carried them all away forever, and I had not even one left. I was afraid to tell anybody." And then he cried so that he could not speak. "Go on," said the young king gently. "What did you do?" "I could do nothing," said the little cripple. "Only I made my garden neat and kept away the weeds, and sometimes I asked other people to let me dig a little for them, and always when I went out I picked up the ugly things I saw lying about, the bits of paper and rubbish, and I dug holes for them in the earth. But I have broken your law." Then the people gasped for breath, for King Amor dismounted from his horse and lifted the little cripple up in his arms and held him against his breast. "You shall ride with me today," he said, "and go to my castle on the mountain crag and live near the stars and the sun. When you kept the weeds from your bare little garden, and when you dug for others and hid away ugliness and disorder, you planted a blue flower every day. You have planted more than all the rest, and your reward shall be the sweetest, for you planted without the seeds." And then the people shouted until the world seemed to ring with their joy, and somehow they knew that King Mordred's land had come into fair days, and they thought it was the blue flower magic. "But the earth is full of magic," Amor said to the Ancient One, after the feast on the plain was over. "Most men know nothing of it, and so comes misery. The first law of the earth's magic is this one. If you fill your mind with a beautiful thought, there will be no room in it for an ugly one. This I learned from you and from my brothers, the stars. So I gave my people the blue flower to think of and work for. It led them to see beauty and to work happily and filled the land with bloom. I, their king, am their brother, and soon they will understand this, and I can help them, and all will be well. They shall be wise and joyous and know good fortune." The little cripple lived near the sun and the stars in the castle on the mountain crag until he grew strong and straight. Then he was the king's chief gardener. The boy who was clever was made captain of his band, which became the king's own guard and never left him. And the gloom of King Mordred's land was forgotten, because it was known all throughout the world as the land of the blue flower. End of The Land of the Blue Flower by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Read by Anne Schwarz for Librivox.
The Little Match Seller by Hans Christian Andersen. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Fraser Prescott. The Little Match Seller. It was terribly cold and nearly dark on the last evening of the old year, and the snow was falling fast. In the cold and the darkness, a poor little girl, with bare head and naked feet, roamed through the streets. It is true she had on a pair of slippers when she left home, but they were not of much use. They were very large, so large indeed that they had belonged to her mother, and the poor little creature had lost them in running across the street to avoid two carriages that were rolling along at a terrible rate. One of the slippers she could not find, and a boy seized upon the other and ran away with it, saying that he could use it as a cradle when he had children of his own. So the little girl went on with her little naked feet, which were quite red and blue with the cold. In an old apron she carried a number of matches, and had a bundle of them in her hands. No one had bought anything of her the whole day, nor had anyone given her even a penny. Shivering with cold and hunger, she crept along. Poor little child, she looked the picture of misery. The snowflakes fell on her long fair hair, which hung in curls on her shoulders, but she regarded them not. Lights were shining from every window, and there was a savory smell of roast goose, for it was New Year's Eve. Yes, she remembered that. In a corner, between two houses, one of which projected beyond the other, she sank down and huddled herself together. She had drawn her little feet under her, but she could not keep off the cold, and she dared not go home, for she had sold no matches, and could not take home even a penny of money. Her father would certainly beat her. Besides, it was almost as cold at home as here, for they had only the roof to cover them, through which the wind howled, although the largest holes had been stopped up with straw and rags. Her little hands were almost frozen with the cold. Ah, perhaps a burning match might be some good, if she could draw it from the bundle and strike it against the wall, just to warm her fingers. She drew one out. Scratch! How it sputtered as it burnt. It gave a warm, bright light, like a little candle, as she held her hand over it. It was a really wonderful light. It seemed to the little girl that she was sitting by a large iron stove, with polished brass feet and a brass ornament. How the fire burned, and seemed so beautifully warm that the child stretched out her feet as if to warm them, when lo, the flame of the match went out, the stove vanished, and she had only the remains of the half-burnt match in her hand. She rubbed another match on the wall. It burst into a flame, and where its light fell upon the wall it became as transparent as a veil, and she could see into the room. The table was covered with a snowy white tablecloth, on which stood a splendid dinner service, and a steaming roast goose, stuffed with apples and dried plums. And what was still more wonderful, the goose jumped down from the dish and waddled across the floor, with a knife and fork in its breast, to the little girl. Then the match went out, and there remained nothing but the thick, damp, cold wall before her. She lighted another match, and then she found herself sitting under a beautiful Christmas tree. It was larger and more beautifully decorated than the one which she had seen through the glass door at the rich merchant's. Thousands of tapers were burning upon the green branches, and colored pictures like those she had seen in the show windows looked down upon it all. The little one stretched out her hand towards them, and the match went out. The Christmas lights rose higher and higher, till they looked to her like the stars in the sky. Then she saw a star fall, leaving behind it a bright streak of fire. Someone is dying, thought the little girl, for her old grandmother, the only one who had ever loved her, and who was now dead, had told her that when a star falls, a soul was going up to God. She again rubbed a match on the wall, and the light shone round her. In the brightness stood her old grandmother, clear and shining, yet mild and loving in her appearance. "Grandmother," cried the little one, "oh, take me with you. I know you will go away when the match burns out. You will vanish like the warm stove, the roast goose, and the large, glorious Christmas tree." And she made haste to light the whole bundle of matches, for she wished to keep her grandmother there. And then the matches glowed with a light that was brighter than the noonday, and her grandmother had never appeared so large or so beautiful. She took the little girl in her arms, and they both flew upwards in brightness and joy, far above the earth, where there was neither cold, nor hunger, nor pain, for they were with God. In the dawn of morning there lay the poor little one, with pale cheeks and smiling mouth, leaning against the wall. She had been frozen to death on the last evening of the year, and the New Year's sun rose and shone upon a little corpse. The child still sat in the stiffness of death, holding the matches in her hand, one bundle of which was burnt. "She tried to warm herself," said some. No one imagined what beautiful things she had seen, nor into what glory she had entered with her grandmother on New Year's Day. End of The Little Match Seller by Hans Christian Andersen. This recording is in the public domain.
The Tale of Samuel Whiskers, or The Roly-Poly Pudding, by Beatrix Potter. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit Librivox.org. Once upon a time, there was an old cat called Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit, who was an anxious parent. She used to lose her kittens continually, and whenever they were lost, they were always in mischief. On baking day, she determined to shut them up in a cupboard. She caught Moppet and Mittens, but she could not find Tom. Mrs. Tabitha went up and down all over the house, mewing for Tom Kitten. She looked in the pantry under the staircase, and she searched the best spare bedroom that was all covered up with dust sheets. She went right upstairs and looked into the attics, but she could not find him anywhere. It was an old house full of cupboards and passages. Some of the walls were 4 feet thick, and there used to be queer noises inside them, as if there might be a little secret staircase. Certainly there were odd little jagged doorways in the wainscot, and things disappeared at night, especially cheese and bacon. Mrs. Tabitha became more and more distracted. She mewed dreadfully. While their mother was searching the house, Moppet and Mittens had gotten to mischief. The cupboard door was not locked, so they pushed it open and came out. They went straight to the dough, which was set to rise in a pan before the fire. They patted it with their soft little paws. "Shall we make dear little muffins?" said Mittens to Moppet. But just at that moment, somebody knocked on the front door, and Moppet jumped into the flour barrel in a fright. Mittens ran away to the dairy and hid in an empty jar on the stone shelf where the milk pans stand. The visitor was a neighbor, Mrs. Ribby. She had called to borrow some yeast. Mrs. Tabitha came downstairs mewing dreadfully. "Come in, Cousin Ribby, come in, and sit ye down. I'm in sad trouble, Cousin Ribby," said Tabitha, shedding tears. "I've lost my dear son Thomas. I'm afraid the rats have got him." She wiped her eyes with her apron. "He's a bad kitten, Cousin Tabitha. He made a cat's cradle of my best bonnet the last time I came to tea. Where have you looked for him?" "All over the house. The rats are too many for me." "What a thing it is to have an unruly family," said Mrs. Tabitha Twitchit. "I'm not afraid of rats. I will help you find him, and whip him, too. What is all that soot in the fender?" The chimney wants sweeping. Oh, dear me, Cousin Ribby. Now Moppet and Mittens are gone. They have both got out of the cupboard." Ribby and Tabitha set to work to search the house thoroughly again. They poked under the beds with Ribby's umbrella, and they rummaged in the cupboards. They even fetched a candle and looked inside a clothes chest in one of the attics. They could not find anything. But once they heard a door bang, and someone scuttered downstairs. "Yes, it is infested with rats," said Tabitha tearfully. "I caught 7 young ones out of one hole in the back kitchen, and we had them for dinner last Saturday. And once I saw the old father rat, an enormous old rat, Cousin Ribby. I was just going to jump on him when he showed his yellow teeth at me and whisked down the hole." "The rats get upon my nerves, Cousin Ribby," said Tabitha. Ribby and Tabitha searched and searched. They both heard a curious roly-poly noise under the attic floor, but there was nothing to be seen. They returned to the kitchen. "Here's one of your kittens at last," said Ribby, dragging Moppet out of the flour barrel. They shook the flour off her and set her down on the kitchen floor. She seemed to be in a terrible fright. "Oh, mother, mother," said Moppet, "there's an old woman rat in the kitchen, and she's stolen some of the dough." The 2 cats ran to look at the dough pan. Sure enough, there were marks of little scratching fingers, and a lump of dough was gone. "Which way did she go, Moppet?" but Moppet had been much too frightened to peep out of the barrel again. Ribby and Tabitha took her with them to keep her safely in sight, while they went on with their search. They went into the dairy. The first thing they found was Mittens hiding in an empty jar. They tipped up the jar, and she scrambled out. "Oh, mother, mother," said Mittens. "Oh, mother, mother, there has been an old man rat in the dairy, a dreadful, 'normous big rat, mother, and he's stolen a pat of butter and the rolling pin." Ribby and Tabitha looked at one another. A rolling pin and butter? "Oh, my poor son Thomas!" exclaimed Tabitha, wringing her paws. "A rolling pin?" said Ribby. "Did we not hear a roly-poly noise in the attic when we were looking into that chest?" Ribby and Tabitha rushed upstairs again. Sure enough, the roly-poly noise was still going on quite distinctly under the attic floor. "This is serious, Cousin Tabitha," said Ribby. "We must send for John Joyner at once, with a saw." Now this is what had been happening to Tom Kitten, and it shows how very unwise it is to go up a chimney in a very old house, where a person does not know his way, and where there are enormous rats. Tom Kitten did not want to be shut up in a cupboard. When he saw that his mother was going to bake, he determined to hide. He looked about for a nice, convenient place, and he fixed upon the chimney. The fire had only just been lighted, and it was not hot, but there was a white, choky smoke from the green sticks. Tom Kitten got upon the fender and looked up. It was a big, old-fashioned fireplace. The chimney itself was wide enough inside for a man to stand up and walk about, so there was plenty of room for a little tomcat. He jumped right up into the fireplace, balancing himself upon the iron bar where the kettle hangs. Tom Kitten took another big jump off the bar and landed on a ledge high up inside the chimney, knocking down some soot into the fender. Tom Kitten coughed and choked with the smoke, and he could hear the sticks beginning to crackle and burn in the fireplace down below. He made up his mind to climb right to the top and get out on the slates and try to catch sparrows. "I cannot go back. If I slipped, I might fall in the fire and singe my beautiful tail and my little blue jacket." The chimney was a very big, old-fashioned one. It was built in the days when people burnt logs of wood upon the hearth. The chimney stack stood up above the roof like a little stone tower, and the daylight shone down from the top, under the slanting slates that kept out the rain. Tom Kitten was getting very frightened. He climbed up and up and up. Then he waded sideways through inches of soot. He was like a little sweep himself. It was most confusing in the dark. One flue seemed to lead into another. There was less smoke, but Tom Kitten felt quite lost. He scrambled up and up. But before he reached the chimney top, he came to a place where somebody had loosened a stone in the wall. There were some mutton bones lying about. "This seems funny," said Tom Kitten. "Who has been gnawing bones up here in the chimney? I wish I had never come. And what a funny smell! It is something like mouse, only dreadfully strong. Oh, it makes me sneeze," said Tom Kitten. He squeezed through the hole in the wall and dragged himself along a most uncomfortably tight passage where there was scarcely any light. He groped his way carefully for several yards. He was at the back of the skirting board in the attic. All at once he fell head over heels in the dark down a hole and landed on a heap of very dirty rags. When Tom Kitten picked himself up and looked about him, he found himself in a place that he had never seen before, although he had lived all his life in the house. It was a very small, stuffy, fusty room, with boards and rafters and cobwebs and lath and plaster. Opposite to him, as far away as he could sit, was an enormous rat. "What do you mean by tumbling into my bed all covered with smuts?" said the rat, chattering his teeth. "Please, sir, the chimney wants sweeping," said poor Tom Kitten. "Anna Maria, Anna Maria," squeaked the rat. There was a pattering noise, and an old woman rat poked her head round a rafter. All in a minute she rushed upon Tom Kitten, and before he knew what was happening, his coat was pulled off and he was rolled up in a bundle and tied with string in very hard knots. Anna Maria did the tying. The old rat watched her and took snuff. When she had finished, they both sat staring at him with their mouths open. "Anna Maria," said the old man rat, whose name was Samuel Whiskers, "Anna Maria, make me a kitten dumpling roly-poly pudding for my dinner." "It requires dough and a pat of butter and a rolling pin," said Anna Maria, considering Tom Kitten with her head on one side. "No," said Samuel Whiskers, "make it properly, Anna Maria, with breadcrumbs." "Nonsense! Butter and dough," replied Anna Maria. The two rats consulted together for a few minutes, and then went away. Samuel Whiskers got through a hole in the wainscot and went boldly down the front staircase to the dairy to get the butter. He did not meet anybody. He made a second journey for the rolling pin. He pushed it in front of him with his paws, like a brewer's man trundling a barrel. He could hear Ribby and Tabitha talking, but they were busy lighting the candle to look into the chest. They did not see him. Anna Maria went down by way of the skirting board and a window shutter to the kitchen to steal the dough. She borrowed a small saucer and scooped up the dough with her paws. She did not observe Moppet. While Tom Kitten was left alone under the floor of the attic, he wriggled about and tried to mew for help. But his mouth was full of soot and cobwebs, and he was tied up in such very tight knots, and he could not make anyone hear him, except a spider, which came out of a crack in the ceiling and examined the knots critically from a safe distance. It was a judge of knots because it had a habit of tying up unfortunate bluebottles. It did not offer to assist him. Tom Kitten wriggled and squirmed until he was quite exhausted. Presently the rats came back and set to work to make him into a dumpling. First they smeared him with butter, and then they rolled him in the dough. "Will not the string be very indigestible, Anna Maria?" inquired Samuel Whiskers. Anna Maria said she thought it was of no consequence, but she wished that Tom Kitten would hold his head still, as it disarranged the pastry. She laid hold of his ears. Tom Kitten bit and spat and mewed and wriggled, and the rolling pin went roly-poly roly, roly-poly roly. The rats each held an end. "His tail is sticking out. You did not fetch enough dough, Anna Maria." "I fetched as much as I could carry," replied Anna Maria. "I do not think," said Samuel Whiskers, pausing to take a look at Tom Kitten, "I do not think it will be a good pudding. It smells sooty." Anna Maria was about to argue the point, when all at once there began to be other sounds up above, the rasping noise of a saw, and the noise of a little dog scratching and yelping. The rats dropped the rolling pin and listened attentively. "We are discovered and interrupted, Anna Maria. Let us collect our property, and other people's, and depart at once. I fear that we shall be obliged to leave this pudding, but I am persuaded that the knots would have proved indigestible, whatever you may have urged to the contrary. Come away at once and help me tie up some mutton bones in a counterpane," said Anna Maria. "I have got half a smoked ham hidden in the chimney." So it happened that by the time John Joyner had got the plank up, there was nobody under the floor except the rolling pin and Tom Kitten in a very dirty dumpling. but there was a strong smell of rats. And John Joiner spent the rest of the morning sniffing and whining and wagging his tail, and going round and round with his head in the hole like a gimlet. Then he nailed the plank down again and put his tools in his bag and came downstairs. The cat family had quite recovered. They invited him to stay to dinner. The dumpling had been peeled off Tom Kitten and made separately into a bag pudding, with currants in it to hide the smut. They had been obliged to put Tom Kitten into a hot bath to get the butter off. John Joiner smelt the pudding, but he regretted that he had not time to stay to dinner, because he had just finished making a wheelbarrow for Miss Potter, and she had ordered 2 hen coops. And when I was going to the post late in the afternoon, I looked up the lane from the corner, and I saw Mr. Samuel Whiskers and his wife on the run, with big bundles on a little wheelbarrow, which looked very like mine. They were just turning in at the gate to the barn of Farmer Potatoes. Samuel Whiskers was puffing and out of breath. Anna Maria was still arguing in shrill tones. She seemed to know her way, and she seemed to have a quantity of luggage. I am sure I never gave her leave to borrow my wheelbarrow. They went into the barn and hauled their parcels with a bit of string to the top of the haymow. After that, there were no more rats for a long time at Tabitha Twitchit's. As for Farmer Potatoes, he has been driven nearly distracted. There are rats and rats and rats in his barn. They eat up the chicken food, and steal the oats and bran, and make holes in the meal bags. And they are all descended from Mr. and Mrs. Samuel Whiskers, children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren. There is no end to them. Moppet and Mittens have grown up into very good rat-catchers. They go out rat-catching in the village, and they find plenty of employment. They charge so much a dozen, and earn their living very comfortably. They hang up the rats' tails in a row on the barn door to show how many they have caught. Dozens and dozens of them. But Tom Kitten has always been afraid of a rat. He never durst face anything that is bigger than a mouse. End of the Tale of Samuel Whiskers, or the Roly-Poly Pudding, by Beatrix Potter. Read by Charlie Newsome.
The Good Sea Monster by Abby Phillips Walker. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. On an island of rocks out in the ocean lived a sea monster. His head was large, and when he opened his mouth it looked like a cave. It had been said that he was so huge that he could swallow a ship, and that on stormy nights he sat on the rocks and the flashing of his eyes could be seen for miles around. The sailors spoke of him with fear and trembling, but as you can see, the sea monster had really been a friend to them, showing them the rock in the storm by flashing his eyes. But because he looked so hideous, all who beheld him thought he must be a cruel monster. One night there was a terrible storm, and the monster went out into the ocean to see if any ship was wrecked in the night, and, if possible, help anyone that was floating about. He found one little boy floating about on a plank. His name was Coco, and when he saw the monster he was afraid. But when Coco saw that the monster did not attempt to harm him, he climbed on the monster's back, and he took him to the rocky island. Then the monster went back into the sea, and Coco wondered if he were to be left alone. But after a while the monster returned and opened his mouth very wide. Coco ran when he saw the huge mouth, for he thought the monster intended to swallow him. But as he did not follow him, Coco went back. The monster opened his mouth again, and Coco asked, "Do you want me to go inside?" And the monster nodded his head. "It must be for my own good," said Coco, "for he could easily swallow me if he wished, without waiting for me to walk in." So Coco walked into the big mouth and down a dark passage, but what the monster wanted him to do he could not think. He could see very faintly now, and after a while he saw a stove, a chair, and a table. "I will take these out," said Coco, "for I am sure I can use them." He took them to a cave on the island, and when he returned the monster was gone. But he soon returned, and again he opened his mouth. Coco walked in this time without waiting, and he found boxes and barrels of food which he stored away in the cave. When Coco had removed everything, the monster lay down and went to sleep. Coco cooked his dinner, and then he awoke the monster and said, "Dinner is ready." But the monster shook his head and plunged into the ocean. He soon returned with his mouth full of fish. Then Coco knew that the monster had brought all the things from a sunken ship for him, and he began to wish that the monster could talk, for he no longer feared him. "I wish you could talk," he said. "I can," the monster replied. "No one ever wished it before. An old witch changed me into a monster and put me on this island, where no one could reach me, and the only way I can be restored to my original form is for someone to wish it." "I wish it," said Coco. "You have had your wish," said the monster, "and I can talk. But for me to become a man, someone else must wish it." The monster and Coco lived for a long time on the island. He took Coco for long rides on his back, and when the waves were too high and Coco was afraid the monster would open his mouth, and Coco would crawl inside and be brought back safe to the island. One night after a storm, Coco saw something floating on the water, and he jumped on the monster's back and they swam out to it. It proved to be a little girl, about Coco's age, who had been on one of the wrecked vessels, and they brought her to the island. At first she was afraid of the monster, but when she learned that he had saved Coco as well as her, and brought them all their food, she became as fond of him as Coco was. "I wish he were a man," she said one day, as she sat on his back with Coco, ready for a sail. Splash went both children into the water, and there, in the place of the monster, was an old man. He caught the children in his arms and brought them to the shore. "But what will we do for food, now that you are a man?" asked Coco. "We shall want for nothing now," replied the old man. "I am a sea god, and can do many things. Now that I have my own form again, we will change this island into a beautiful garden, and when the little girl and you are grown up and married, you shall have a castle, and all the sea gods and nymphs will care for you. You will never want for anything again. I will take you out on the ocean on the backs of my dolphins." Coco and the little girl lived on the enchanted island, and all the things that the old sea god promised came true. End of The Good Sea Monster by Abby Phillips Walker. Read by Brianna Chiles.
The Tale of Squirrel, Nutkin by Beatrix Potter. This is the Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Read by Chad Horner. This is a tale about a tale that belonged to a little red squirrel, and his name was Nutkin. He had a brother called Twinkleberry, and a great many cousins. They lived in a wood at the edge of a lake. In the middle of the lake there was an island covered with trees and nut bushes, and among those trees stands a hollow oak tree, which is the house of an owl who is called Old Brown. One autumn, when the nuts were ripe and the leaves on the hazel bushes were golden and green, Nutkin and Twinkleberry and all the other little squirrels came out of the wood and down on the edge of the lake. They made little rafts out of twigs, and they paddled away over the water to Owl Island to gather nuts. Each squirrel had a little sack and a large oar, and spread out his tail for a sail. They also took with them an offering of 3 fat mice as a present for Old Brown, and put them down upon his doorstep. Then Twinkleberry and the other little squirrels each made a low bow and said politely, "Old Mr. Brown, will you favour us with permission to gather nuts upon your island?" But Nutkins was excessively impertinent in his manners. He bobbed up and down like a little red cherry, singing, riddle me, rot, tot, toot, a little wee man in a red, red coat, a staff in his right hand and a stone in his throat. If you'll tell me his riddle, I'll give you a groat. Now this riddle is as old as the hills. Mr. Brown paid no attention whatever to Nutkin. He shut his eyes obstinately and went to sleep. The squirrels filled their little sacks with nuts and sailed away home in the evening. But next morning they all came back again to Owl Island, and Twinkleberry and the others brought a fine fat mole and laid it on the stone in front of Old Brown's doorway and said, "Mr. Brown, will you favour us with your gracious permission to gather some more nuts?" But Nutkin, who had no respect, began to dance up and down, tinkling old Mr. Brown with a nettle, and singing, "Old Mr. B, riddle me ree, hitty petty within the wall, hitty petty without the wall. If you touch hitty petty will bite you." Mr. Brown woke up suddenly and carried the mole into his house. He shut the door in Nutkin's face. Presently a little thread of blue smoke from a wood fire came up from the top of the tree, and Nutkin peeped through the keyhole and sang, "A house full, a hole full, and you cannot gather a bowl full." The squirrels searched for nuts all over the island and filled their little sacks, but Nutkin gathered oak apples, yellow and scarlet, and sat upon a beech stump, playing marbles and watching the door of old Mr. Brown. On the third day the squirrels got up very early and went fishing. They caught 7 fat minnows as a present for Old Brown. They paddled over the lake and landed under a crooked chestnut tree on Owl Island. Twinkleberry and 6 other little squirrels each carried a fat minnow. But Nutkin, who had no nice manners, brought no present at all. He ran in front singing, "The man in the wilderness said to me, how many strawberries grow in the sea? I answered him as I thought good, as many red herrings as grow in the wood." But old Mr. Brown took no interest in riddles, not even when the answer was provided for him. On the 4th day the squirrels brought a present of 6 fat beetles, which were as good as plums in plum pudding for Old Brown. Each beetle was wrapped up carefully in a dock leaf, fastened with a pine needle pin. But Nutkin sang as rudely as ever, "Old Mr. B, riddle me ree, flower of England, fruit of Spain, meet together in a shower of rain, put in a bag tied round with a string. If you'll tell me this riddle, I'll give you a ring." Which was ridiculous of Nutkin, because he had not got any ring to give to Old Brown. The other squirrels hunted up and down the nut bushes, but Nutkin gathered robins' pincushions off a briar bush and stuck them full of pine needle pins. On the 5th day the squirrels brought a present of wild honey. It was so sweet and sticky that they licked their fingers as they put it down upon the stone. They had stolen it out of a bumblebee's nest on the tippity top of the hill. But Nutkin skipped up and down, singing, "Hum-a-bum, buzz, buzz, hum-a-bum, buzz. As I went over Tipple-Tine, I met a flock of bonny swine, some yellow-nacked and some yellow-backed. They were the very bonniest swine that e'er went over Tipple-Tine." Old Mr. Brown turned up his eyes in disgust at the impertinence of Nutkin, but he ate up the honey. The squirrels filled their little sacks with nuts, but Nutkin sat upon a big flat rock and played 9-pins with a crab-apple and green. On the 6th day, which was Saturday, the squirrels came again for the last time. They brought a new laid egg in a little rush basket as a last parting present for Old Brown. But Nutkin ran in front laughing and shouting, "Humpty Dumpty lies in the beck, with the white counterpane round his neck. 40 doctors and 40 wrights cannot put Humpty Dumpty to rights." Now, old Mr. Brown took an interest in eggs. He opened one eye and shut it again, but still did not speak. Nutkin became more and more impertinent. Old Mr. B, hickamore hackamore on the king's kitchen door. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't drive hickamore hackamore off the king's kitchen door. Nutkin danced up and down like a sunbeam, but still Old Brown said nothing at all. Nutkin began again. "Arthur O'Bower has broken his band. He comes roaring up the land. The King of Scots with all his power cannot turn Arthur of the Bower." Nutkin made a worried noise to sound like the wind, and he took a running jump right onto the head of Old Brown. Then all at once there was a flutterment and a scufflement and a loud squeak. The other squirrels scuttered away into the bushes. When they came back very cautiously, peeping round the tree, there was Old Brown sitting on his doorstep, quite still, with his eyes closed, as if nothing had happened. But Nutkin was in his waistcoat pocket. This looks like the end of the story, but it isn't. Old Brown carried Nutkin into his house and held him up by the tail, intending to skin him, but Nutkin pulled so very hard that his tail broke in two, and he dashed up the staircase and escaped out of the attic window. And to this day, if you meet Nutkin up a tree and ask him a riddle, he will throw sticks at you and stamp his feet and scold and shout, "Cooke, cooke, 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 cooke." End of The Tale of Squirrel Nutkin by Beatrix Potter.
The Wise Old Gander by Abby Phillips Walker. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Once there lived a farmer who was not a good caretaker. He did not have a house for the hens and chickens and geese and ducks. An old fox who lived in a hole over the hill never had any trouble in getting a nice goose or a fat hen for his supper or breakfast. "Something must be done at once," said Madam Goose. "There will be no one left in the whole yard if this keeps on. Why, only last night Madam Grey Hen was carried off, and she has left all those little chicks. It is really too awful to think of." "But what can we do?" asked Grey Goose. "The rooster does not know, for I heard one of his family ask him, and he only said the master should take better care of us." "So he should," replied Madam Goose. "But he doesn't, so we must care for ourselves unless we wish to be carried off too. Let us go to Gander. He may be able to help us." "Come with us," they called to the rooster and black hen who were walking together. "We are going to see the gander and ask him to help us to be rid of old fox over the hill." The gander stretched out his neck and blinked his eyes as he listened to their tale of woe. "You are right. Something must be done," he said, "and you are quite right in coming to me also. I will think over the matter and give you my advice later." "Later?" screamed Madam Goose. "There will be no need for advice. There will be no one to give it or to advise. What we need is advice at once, and something that will rid us of old fox under the hill. He is eating the whole yard, one by one." "Well, well," answered the gander, standing on one foot and then on the other. "I will think over the matter for a short time, and then tell you my decision. You know, my dear madam, that great minds must have quiet to think out important matters. Leave me, I beg of you all, for a little while." As soon as the gander was alone, he waddled over to the pig pen. "Mr. Pig," he said, "I am going to ask your advice. Old Fox over the hill is carrying off all the fowls and something must be done." Grunted the pig. "I can tell you what will frighten him away. I will stay awake tonight and grunt at him. He will know better than to linger where I am." Thank you, Mr. Pig," said the gander, backing away from the pig pen. "I will tell my friends that I am sure they will feel safe tonight." "Conceited fellow," said the gander. "I guess it will take more than his grunts to scare that foxy fellow." He then went to the donkey. "He isn't very wise," thought the gander, "but sometimes those who have the least wisdom speak wisdom without knowing it. Mr. Donkey, I have come to ask your advice. Old Fox is carrying off our hens and geese. Something must be done to stop him, or soon there will be none left." Quite so. I see, Mr. Gander," said the donkey. "You have come to the right place for advice. Now go back to your friends and tell them to have no fear. I will take the matter in hand." "But what are you going to do?" asked the gander. "Why, my dear sir, I'm going to bray at old Fox when he comes. I'm going to bray at him, and you will see he will not stay long when he hears my commanding voice." "Oh, how can I ever thank you?" said the gander, walking away. "I will tell my friends at once that you will take care of them tonight." "Foolish old donkey," the gander said to himself. "I guess old Fox has heard donkey bray before this. I'll try the cow next. Madam Cow, old Fox is carrying off all the fowls, one by one, and if something is not done at once to stop him, there will be none of us left. What would you advise?" "Oh, don't ask me, Mr. Gander," said the cow. "All I can do is moo, and old Fox would no more mind that than the wind blowing. I wish I were wise enough to advise you, but I am not. But if I can help you in any way, let me know." "Thank you, Madam Cow," said the gander, waddling away. "You may hear from me. We never can tell when we shall need the help of our friends." The next one the gander visited was the cat. "Can you help me, Madam Puss?" began the gander. "We fowls are all in trouble. Old Fox carries off one or more of our numbers every night, and something must be done to stop it at once." The cat opened her mouth very wide and yawned, and the gander wondered if he had been wise after all in asking her advice in this matter. But Puss closed her mouth with a snap and sat up. "Of course I can help you," she said. "Did you ever see my claws?" The gander backed away as Puss held them up to his view. The gander confessed that he had not, and Puss went on, "Well, leave it to me to protect the barnyard. That dog Rover never seems to think about anything but eating and sleeping. I will yowl and spit at old Fox when he comes tonight, and I can tell you and your friends he will not come again." Thank you, Madam Puss," said the gander, running away. "My, but that was a narrow escape for me," said the gander. "She positively looks awful when she opens her mouth. I seem to be getting advice, but not the kind that will save my friends. They all feel sure they can scare old Fox, but not one of them will be able to. I don't know that all of them together would." The gander stopped still and held up his head. "I have it," he said. "I have the very plan. I will get them all together, and each shall do his part. I believe we can scare old Fox away for good and all time." The gander went to the dog, and he promised to bark. "Of course. There is no need to have the others around if I do that," said the dog. "But bring them along if you like. Every little helps." That night the donkey, the dog, the cat, the cow, and the pig were gathered in the barnyard. Each one protested that the others were not needed. All but the cow. She was modest and said she would help. Then the rooster came and offered to crow, and the geese were to quack. "Now you all must hide," said the gander, "and don't move until old Fox gets right in the middle of the yard. Then jump up and do your worst." Old Fox waited until it was very late, and then crept over the hill and up to the farm. He listened, and hearing no sound, he crept into the barnyard. He was just about to reach a fat goose when all the animals began. The dog barked, the pig squealed, the donkey brayed, the cow mooed, the geese quacked, the rooster crowed, and Puss, true to her word, yowled and sprang at old Fox, who was so frightened at the terrible noise he forgot to run until Puss struck him with her sharp claws. Then he took to his swiftest speed, and away he went over the hill and far away, and was never seen again near that farm. He told some of his friends that a most horrible animal lived there, and must have eaten all the hens and geese, and was big enough to eat them, for he saw at least 20 feet and claws and heads of all sizes. End of The Wise Old Gander by Abby Phillips Walker. Read by Brianna Chiles.
The Story of Yvashka with the Bear's Ear by Anonymous, translated from the Russian by George Borrow. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Story of Yvashka with the Bear's Ear. In a certain kingdom, in a certain government, there lived a peasant whose wife bore him a son, who had the ear of a bear, on account of which he was called Yvashka, or Jack with the Bear's Ear. Now when Jack with the Bear's Ear was beginning to attain his full growth, he used to walk in the street and endeavor to play with the children, and the child whom he seized by the hand, off he was sure to tear his hand, and whom he seized by the head, off he would tear his head. The other peasants, not being able to put up with such outrages, told Jack's father that he must either cause his son to mend his manners or not permit him to go out into the street to play with the children. The father for a long time struggled to reform Jack, but perceiving that his son did not improve, he resolved to turn him out of doors, and said to him, "Depart from me, and go wheresoever you please. I will keep you no longer in my house, for I am much afraid lest some misfortune should happen to me on your account." So Jack with the Bear's Ear, having taken leave of his father and mother, departed on his way. He journeyed for a long time until he arrived at a forest, where he beheld a man cutting oaken billets. He went up to him and said, "Good fellow, what may be your name?" "Quercillo," replied the other, whereupon they became sworn brothers, and proceeded further. Arriving at a rocky mountain, they perceived a man hewing the rock, to whom they said, "God help you, honest lad, and what may your name be?" "My name is Montano," replied he. Whereupon they called him their brother, and proposed to him that he should leave off digging the mountain, and should consent to go with them forthwith. He agreed to their proposal, and all three forthwith proceeded on their way, and journeyed for some time. Arriving at the bank of a river, they saw a man sitting who had a pair of enormous mustaches, with which he angled for fish for his subsistence. They all three said to him, "God help you, brother, in your fish-catching." "Thank you, brothers," he replied. "What may your name be?" they inquired. "Mustachio," he answered. Whereupon they called him also their brother, and invited him to join their company, which he did not refuse. And so these four journeyed on, and whether they journeyed long or short, far or near, my tale will soon be told, though the deed was a long time in doing. At last they arrived at a forest, where they saw a cabin standing on crow's feet, which kept turning here and there. They went up to it and said, "Cabin, cabin, stand with your rear to the wood and your front to us." The cabin instantly obeyed them, and they, having entered it, began to consult how they should contrive to live there. After that, they all went into the forest, killed some game, and prepared food for themselves. On the second day they left Quercillo at home to cook the dinner, whilst they themselves went into the forest to hunt. Quercillo, having got ready the dinner, took his seat by the window, and awaited the return of his brethren. At that moment came Baba Yaga riding on an iron mortar, which she urged on with the pestle, whilst her tongue lolling out of her mouth, she drew a mark on the earth as she went, and entering into the cabin, she said, "Till now ne'er a Russian wight I've heard with ear or seen with sight, now full clear I see and hear." Then, turning to Quercillo, she inquired, "Wherefore did you come hither, Quercillo?" Thereupon she began to beat him, and continued beating him until he was half dead, after which she devoured all of the food which had been got ready, and then rode off. Upon the return of Corsillo's comrades from the chase, they asked him for their dinner, and he, not informing them that Baba Yaga had been there, said that he had fallen into a swoon, and had got nothing ready. In the very same manner did Baba Yaga treat Montano and Mustachio. At last, it coming to the turn of Jack with the Bear's Ear to sit at home, he remained whilst his comrades went forth in quest of game. Jack cooked and roasted everything, and having found in Baba Yaga's cabin a pot of honey, he placed a post by the perch, and having split it at the top, he thrust in a wedge and emptied the honey upon the post. He himself sat on the perch, concealing behind him the post while he prepared 3 iron rods. After the lapse of a little time, arrived Baba Yaga and screamed forth, "Till now ne'er Russian true I've heard with ear or seen with view. Now I do both hear and view. Wherefore have you come hither, Jack with the Bear's Ear, and why dost thou thus waste my property?" Whereupon she began to lick with her tongue about the post, and no sooner did her tongue arrive at the fissure, than Jack snatched the wedge from out of the post, and having entrapped her tongue, he leaped up from the perch, and scourged her with the iron rods, till she begged that he would let her go, promising that he should be in peace from her, and that she would never more come to him. Jack consented to her prayer, and having set her tongue at liberty, he placed Baba Yaga in a corner, whilst he himself sat by the window awaiting his companions, who soon returned, and imagined that Baba Yaga had acted with him in the same manner as with themselves. But perceiving that he had the food already prepared, they were much astonished thereat. After dinner he related how he had dealt with Baba Yaga, and laughed at them that they were unable to manage her. At last, wishing to show them the drubbed and beaten Baba Yaga, he led them to the corner, but there she was no longer. So they resolved to go in pursuit of her, and having arrived at a stone they lifted it up and perceived a deep abyss, down which they thought of descending. But as none of his companions had courage enough to do this, Jack with the Bear's Ear consented to go. So they began to construct a cable, and having made a canoe for him to sit in, they let him down into the gulf. Meanwhile, Jack commanded them to wait for him a whole week, and provided during this time they received no intelligence of him, to await no longer. "If I be alive and pull the rope, draw up the canoe, provided it be light. But if it be heavy, cut the rope in order that you may not draw up Baba Yaga instead of me." Then, having bid them farewell, he descended into the deep subterranean abyss. He remained there for a long time. At length he arrived at a cabin, which having entered he beheld 3 beautiful damsels sitting at their needle and embroidering with gold, and these were the daughters of Baba Yaga. As soon as they perceived Jack with the Bear's Ear, they said, "Good youth, what has brought you hither? Here lives Baba Yaga, our mother, and as soon as she arrives you are a dead man, for she will slay you to a certainty. But if you will deliver us from this place, we will give you information how you may save your life." He promised to conduct them out of that abyss, and they said to him, "As soon as our mother shall arrive, she will cast herself upon you, and begin to fight with you. But after that she will desist, and will run into the cellar, where she has 2 pitchers standing filled with water. In the blue pitcher is the water of strength, and in the white that of weakness." Scarcely had the daughters of Baba Yaga concluded their discourse, when they heard their mother coming in on the iron mortar driving with the pestle. Whilst her tongue lolling out of her mouth, she drew a mark as she went, whereupon they acquainted Jack. Baba Yaga, having arrived, screamed out, "Till now ne'er a Russ have I heard with ear or seen with eye. Now do I both hear and spy. For what are you come hither, Jack with the Bear's Ear? Do you imagine to disturb me here also?" Then, casting herself suddenly upon him, she began to fight. Both combated for a considerable time, and at length they fell upon the earth. Baba Yaga jumped up and ran into the cellar, whither Jack likewise rushed after her, and she, without examining, seized the white pitcher and Jack the blue one, and both drank. After that, they went out of the cellar and recommenced their combat. Jack, having overpowered her, seized her by the hair and beat Baba Yaga with her own pestle. She began to entreat Jack to take pity upon her, promised to live at peace with him, and that very moment to depart from the place. Jack with the Bear's Ear consented thereto, and ceased beating Baba Yaga. As soon as she was departed, he went to her daughters, thanked them for their information, and told them to prepare to leave the place, Whilst they were packing up their things, he went to the rope, and having pulled at it, his companions instantly let down the canoe, in which he placed the eldest sister, and by her sent word to them to draw them all up. Jack's comrades, having drawn up the damsel, were much astonished at the sight of her, but having learned from her the whole affair, they hoisted up her other sisters. At last they let down the canoe for Jack, but he, having this time stowed into the canoe many clothes and a great deal of money, and having likewise seated himself therein, his comrades, feeling the weight, imagined that it was Baba Yaga who sat there, and cutting the rope, left poor Jack into the abyss. Thereupon they agreed to marry the damsels, and lost no time in so doing. In the meantime, Jack with the bear's ear walked for a long time about this abyss, seeking for an outlet. At last, by good fortune, he found in the gloomy place an iron door, which having broke open, he proceeded for a long time in the same darkness. He then beheld a light at a distance, and directing his course straight towards it, he emerged from the cavern. After this, he determined to seek his comrades, whom he soon found, and the whole three were already married. Upon seeing them, he began to ask them why they had left him in the hole. His comrades, in great terror, told Jack that it was Mustachio who had cut the rope, and him Jack immediately slew, and took his wife to be his own. Then they all lived together, and acquired great riches. End of The Story of Yvashka with the Bear's Ear, by Anonymous, translated from the Russian by George Borrow. Read by Colleen McMahon.